Hello, I'm Arthur Reed. Welcome to the World War II History Channel, where we explore the pivotal moments and untold stories of the greatest generation. Even the ocean, vast and timeless, seemed to hold its breath in the dark. The water, lapping gently against the lonely shores of the world, carried with it a chilling, unspoken whisper. We often look back at the grand tapestry of history and see only the boldest colors, the sweeping declarations, the loud, decisive moments that changed the map. But the true weight of those early, fragile days was not found in the noise. It was found in the profound, heavy silence. It was found in the quiet, empty spaces between the crackling bursts of static on a parlor radio. Imagine a small, modest living room. The curtains are drawn tight against the creeping evening chill, shutting out the fading light of a bruised sky. Inside, the only illumination comes from the warm, amber glow of the radio dial, casting long, soft shadows across the floral wallpaper. A mother sits in a worn, familiar armchair, a half-finished woolen sweater resting heavily in her lap. Her hands are busy, her fingers expertly weaving the yarn, guided by muscle memory. But her mind is miles away. She is adrift on a cold, restless, and unforgiving sea. The house is so quiet you can hear the rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock, a sound that usually brings comfort, but tonight feels like a countdown to an unknown sorrow. Every sudden pop or hiss from the wooden speaker makes her breath catch in her throat. She is listening, waiting with a quiet desperation for a voice, for a name, for any small reassurance that the world hasn't entirely slipped away into the shadows. She knits not just to keep her son warm, but to bind her own fraying hope together, loop by loop, stitch by stitch. Far from the quiet safety of that living room, out where the ocean turns the color of cold, beaten iron, ordinary men were facing an extraordinary terror. These were not seasoned warriors born to the sea. They were farm boys from the dusty plains who had never seen the ocean before they enlisted. They were shopkeepers from quiet, tree-lined avenues. They were school teachers who had gently traded their chalk and chalkboards for the heavy, grease-stained overalls of the merchant marine. They stood on the swaying, rusted decks of old freighters, wrapped in thick wool coats, feeling the deep, steady thrum of the ship's engines vibrating through the worn soles of their boots. The sea spray stung their cheeks, tasting of salt and ancient depths. They were not carrying rifles or charging into glorious battle. They were tending massive boilers in the suffocating heat of the ship's belly. They were baking bread in cramped galleys while the floor tilted violently beneath them. They were simply trying to carry the lifeblood of a struggling world, food, medicine, fuel, blankets, across a treacherous expanse of water. And beneath them, the ocean was a world of ghosts. The men didn't speak of it much. There was an unspoken agreement, a silent pact among the crew to keep the terror neatly folded away. But they all felt it. They felt the invisible presence of the silent hunters beneath the waves. The metal predators, gliding like phantoms through the freezing, pitch-black depths. When the sailors would step out onto the deck for a breath of crisp night air, they would look out at the moonlit whitecaps, sipping bitter, black coffee from tin cups that burned their palms. They tried to focus on the warmth of the cup, trying so hard not to think about what lay beneath the glass-like surface of the water. In the quiet hours of the night, sitting by the dim, flickering light of a swinging bulb in the mess hall, they would write letters home. They used stubby pencils on thin, crinkled paper. They wrote about the biting cold, perhaps. They wrote about how much they missed the scent of pine trees after a summer rain, or the taste of their mother's fresh-baked apple pie. They asked about the family dog, or if the roof had been fixed before the autumn storms. But they never wrote about the fear. They kept the shadows entirely to themselves. They acted as a shield, wrapping their loved ones in a protective, comforting blanket of mundane words and forced, gentle cheer. They carried the heavy burden of the unseen war so that the people they loved wouldn't have to. They were living a secret life out there in the immense dark, a shadow war fought in the quiet, lonely corners of the world, far from the eyes of the public. So much of what truly happened during those heavy years was hidden beneath the surface, kept out of the comforting letters and the bold newspaper headlines. There are so many stories from the shadows that never made it into the history books, tales of quiet espionage, hidden operations, and the invisible, desperate battles that truly turned the tide of the world. If you find yourself drawn to these forgotten corners of history, to the profound secrets whispered in the dark, I want to share something very special with you tonight. It's a free ebook I've put together, crafted with care, called The Shadow War, 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II. It's a quiet, respectful journey into the hidden heroics that changed our world, and I'd love to send it directly to you through my email newsletter. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As those hidden stories unfolded in the dark, the visible world was slowly, heartbreakingly, sinking. Ship after ship was slipping beneath the waves. The ocean was claiming them faster than anyone could comprehend, a slow, agonizing bleed of metal and memory. The lifelines connecting the continents, the invisible threads keeping hope alive, were fraying and snapping one by one in the icy grip of the Atlantic. Back home, the tragic reality began to wash ashore. The telegrams began to arrive. Small, delicate, yellow pieces of paper, delivered by quiet messengers riding bicycles through sleepy, unsuspecting neighborhoods. There would be a gentle knock on the door. The creak of hinges. A sudden, sharp gasp. And then, a weeping so profound and hollow that it seemed to carry through the thin wooden walls of the row houses, settling into the very foundation of the streets. The grief became a heavy, suffocating blanket that lay over everything. It wasn't the fiery, explosive end that people had feared. It felt as though the world was simply going to succumb to a slow, freezing starvation. The light was dimming, not all at once, but degree by degree, as the ocean swallowed the brave men and their sturdy ships. The men in the high, marble-floored offices, the admirals and the weary leaders with their perfectly pressed uniforms and gold braid, stood over massive tables covered in maps. The maps were dotted with little pins, each one representing a ship, a crew, a floating village of souls. Day by day, they watched as aides came in and silently removed pin after pin. They did the math, over and over in the quiet hours of the morning, rubbing their tired eyes, hoping the numbers would somehow lie to them. Hoping they had made a mistake. But the arithmetic of despair was simple, cold, and cruel. The math offered no comfort. They needed ships. They needed an armada just to survive the season. They needed a miraculous bridge of steel to stretch across the vast, terrifying ocean, and they needed it yesterday. But the shipyards were full to bursting. The traditional ways of building, the careful, painstaking, agonizingly slow process of laying a keel, framing the hull, and riveting the plates, took months, sometimes years. It was an art form, a respected craft handed down through generations, but it was too slow. It could never, ever keep up with the hungry, insatiable appetite of the deep sea. "It is impossible," they whispered to one another in the dimly lit corridors. The realization settled over them like dust. The sea, it seemed, had already won. The math could not be beaten. The time it took to build a ship was a fixed law of nature, as unchangeable as the tides themselves. But despair is a peculiar thing. It is a shadow that can only exist where there is an absence of light. And just when the night feels most impenetrable, just when the cold damp seems to reach the very marrow of a nation's bones, a quiet spark often catches. Far away from the Grand Admiral's maps, far from the icy, turbulent waves of the Atlantic, a different kind of man was standing on a muddy, empty shoreline. A man who didn't know the traditional, sacred rules of the sea. A man who didn't know how things had always been done. And because he didn't know the rules, he didn't know that what the world desperately needed was impossible. As the dark tide of despair rolled in, threatening to drown the world in sorrow, a quiet, stubborn audacity was slowly preparing to meet it. Somewhere in the dusk, someone was looking at the mud, looking at the water, and daring to dream of building a sanctuary in the storm. The greatest miracles rarely begin in polished halls, they begin in the cold, unyielding mud. Picture a desolate stretch of coastline in the quiet, gray hours of early morning. The tide is out, leaving behind a vast, shimmering expanse of dark earth and shallow pools that reflect the bruised, overcast sky. The wind here is lonely. It sweeps off the water, carrying the sharp, bitter scent of salt and ancient kelp, tugging at the collar of a man standing entirely alone on the shoreline. His shoes are sinking, just a little, into the soft, wet clay. He doesn't seem to notice the dampness seeping through his soles, nor the chill that hangs in the heavy sea air. He is a man who knows the earth. His hands are thick, familiar with the rough textures of rock and the gritty dust of progress. He is not a sailor. He has no grand naval lineage. If you were to look at his resume, you would see a man who moved mountains of dirt, a man who poured oceans of concrete to tame wild rivers and build great dams. His name is Henry, and as he looks out over the empty, muddy flats, he is not seeing the bleakness of the landscape. He is seeing a ghost city waiting to be born. In the quiet sanctuary of his mind, Henry is listening to a different kind of music. It is not the sorrowful dirge that is playing across the rest of the world. It is the steady, rhythmic hum of possibility. The admirals in their warm, wood-paneled offices had told him it couldn't be done. They had spoken to him in hushed, patronizing tones, explaining the sacred, unhurried art of shipbuilding. A ship, they told him, is like a living, breathing creature. It must be coaxed into existence slowly, lovingly, over many long months. You lay the keel, you build the ribs, you heat the rivets one by one until they glow like captured stars, and you slowly stitch the steel together. It is a craft of patience. Henry had listened to them, nodding respectfully, his face a calm, unreadable mask. But inside, his heart was aching with a quiet, desperate urgency. He knew, just as the mothers sitting by their radios knew, that the world did not have time for patience. The dark waters of the Atlantic were too hungry. So, he took a train away from the marble columns of the capital. He traveled to this quiet, forgotten edge of the continent, where the land meets the sea in a messy, muddy embrace. Let us sit beside him for a moment, later that evening, in a small, glowing diner on the edge of town. The neon sign outside buzzes softly, a comforting, warm sound in the cool night. Inside, it smells of roasted coffee and warm pie crust. The diner is mostly empty, just a tired truck driver nodding off in a corner booth, and the waitress, a kind-eyed woman with tired feet, quietly wiping down the counter. Henry sits at a small table near the window. He has a cup of black coffee in front of him, the steam twisting gently into the air. In his hands, he holds a simple wooden pencil. The paper napkin on the table is covered in soft, smudged graphite lines. He is not drawing a ship the way a traditional architect would. He is not drawing graceful curves or sweeping bows. He is drawing boxes. He thinks about the dams he built. When you build a dam, you don't build it all at once. You pour it in sections. You bring the pieces together. He thinks about the trucks rumbling down the highways he paved. A truck is just a collection of parts, built in different places, brought together on an assembly line. Why, he wonders in the gentle quiet of the diner, can a ship not be a truck? He sketches a piece of the hull. Then he sketches another piece, separate from the first. He imagines a world where a ship is not built from the ground up, but where its pieces are borne all across the yard, a bow taking shape in one corner, a deck forming in another, a deckhouse rising under a different roof. And then, as if guided by invisible strings, they all move together, sliding perfectly into place. It is a child's way of thinking. It is blocks on a playroom floor. It is wonderfully, beautifully simple. And because it is so simple, the experts believe it is entirely foolish. But Henry knows something the experts do not. He knows the hidden strength of ordinary hands. He knows that if you give a farmer, or a baker, or a schoolteacher a piece of a puzzle, they can put it together. They do not need to understand the entire ocean, they only need to understand their one, small piece of the ship. The waitress walks over, the coffee pot in her hand. She smiles down at him, a soft, weary smile. "Working late, mister?" she asks, her voice a gentle melody in the quiet room. Henry looks up from his napkin, his eyes catching the warm light of the diner. "Just dreaming," he whispers softly. "Just trying to figure out how to build a boat." She tops off his cup, the dark liquid swirling gently. "Well," she says, her gaze drifting toward the dark window, toward the unseen ocean. "We sure could use a few more of those." He watches her walk away, realizing that he is not just building machines of steel. He is building vessels of hope. Every ship he can pull from the mud is a promise to that waitress, to the mothers by the radios, to the boys freezing in the dark waters. It is a promise that they are not alone, that someone, somewhere, is working through the night to bring them a miracle. Piece by piece. That was his answer. Not with grand, sweeping strokes, but with small, deliberate actions, gathering fragments and weaving them together into something vast and unbreakable. It is a beautiful thought, isn't it? The idea that massive, insurmountable problems can be solved by simply breaking them down into small, quiet pieces. In many ways, gathering the forgotten memories of the past requires that very same quiet dedication. Unearthing these gentle human stories from the heavy dust of history, finding the lost letters, tracing the faded photographs, and carefully stitching them together into these soothing narratives, takes countless hours of solitary, loving research. It is a slow, quiet craft of piecing together fragments of time so they can live and breathe once more. If you find comfort in these stories, and if you would like to help keep this quiet harbor of history alive, I have created a small Ko-Fi tip jar. It is a place where you can leave a small token of support, even just $1, to help fuel the long hours of research and writing that go into crafting these journeys. It means the absolute world to me, and it allows us to continue unearthing these beautiful, forgotten lives together. But, please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The next morning, the fog is thick and heavy, rolling over the mudflats like a soft, gray blanket. The silence of the shore is broken, just barely, by the crunch of tires on gravel. A small convoy of mud-splattered cars pulls up to the edge of the water. Men in heavy coats and wide-brimmed hats step out into the chill. They are surveyors, engineers, men who have followed Henry from the concrete canyons of the dams to this desolate stretch of nothingness. They stand beside him in the damp grass, looking out into the impenetrable fog. They cannot see the water. They cannot see the horizon. Henry, one of them murmurs, his breath pluming in the cold air. "There's nothing here but mud and water. We don't have slipways. We don't have cranes. We don't even have a road." Henry simply smiles, a quiet, peaceful smile that crinkles the corners of his eyes. He bends down, his fingers brushing the wet, cold earth. He picks up a handful of the muddy clay, feeling its weight, its potential. "We have the ground," Henry whispers gently, his voice barely carrying over the distant hush of the waves. "And we have our hands. That is all we have ever needed." He points a dirt-stained finger toward the gray void. "We will dig a basin there. We will pour the floors there. We won't build these ships up into the sky, we will build them in the earth, and when they are ready, we will simply open the gates and let the ocean come in to greet them." The men look at him, and then they look back at the fog. They are terrified, of course. The weight of what they are about to attempt is staggering. If they fail, they will be a laughingstock. Worse, if they fail, the lifeline across the sea will finally snap. But as they stand there in the damp chill, watching the quiet certainty in Henry's eyes, the fear begins to slowly ebb away, replaced by a strange, blooming warmth in their chests. It is the warmth of belief. They are not naval architects. They are not grand men of history. They are men of dust and dirt. But standing on that muddy shore, they silently agree to do the impossible. They walk back to their cars, the quiet closing in behind them. The real work is about to begin. The mudflats will soon be violently awakened. But for this one fleeting moment, the shore is still. The architect of dust takes one last look at the empty canvas before him. He imagines the distant, soothing sound of a ship's horn echoing through the fog, a lullaby of steel and steam. He tucks his hands deep into his coat pockets, turns away from the wind, and begins the long, quiet walk toward a miracle. There is a special kind of coldness found not in the winter wind, but in the polite, quiet closing of a heavy, mahogany door. Far away from the damp, salty mudflats where dreams were just beginning to take root in the soil, the true war of belief was being waged in a city of immaculate marble and perfectly manicured lawns. In the heart of the capital, the halls of the Navy Department stretched out like long, quiet caverns of authority. The floors were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the warm, golden glow of brass lamps and the austere, unsmiling portraits of men who had spent their lives studying the moods of the ocean. Here, in these hushed, quiet rooms, history was not something you made with your bare hands in the dirt. History was a careful, deliberate thing. It was bound in heavy leather books, debated in soft, measured tones, and governed by rules as old and deep as the sea itself. The men who sat behind the sprawling oak desks were not villains. They were simply protectors. They were veterans who loved the ships they sailed, men who understood that the ocean is a merciless judge. To them, a ship was a sacred thing, a floating cathedral of steel that had to be coaxed into existence with absolute reverence. You could not rush the creation of a vessel any more than you could rush the changing of the seasons. To build a ship was an art form, requiring years of apprenticeship, careful measurements, and an unwavering respect for tradition. And into this quiet, deeply entrenched world walked a man with dust on his shoes and an impossible timeline in his pocket. Henry moved through the pristine corridors feeling every inch the outsider. He did not have the refined posture of a naval officer. He did not speak the clipped, precise language of military strategy. His hands were thick, used to gripping the wooden handles of tools and the steering wheels of heavy trucks. When he walked into the grand offices, smelling faintly of the earth and the open road, he brought an uncomfortable, restless energy into a room that valued stillness. Imagine him sitting in a high-backed leather chair, a chair that feels just a little too soft, just a little too yielding. Across the wide, gleaming expanse of the desk sit the men of the brass. Their uniforms are impeccably pressed, a testament to order and discipline. Henry unrolls his blueprints. They are not the beautiful, sweeping artistic renderings the admirals are used to seeing. They are practical, blunt, and rough. He speaks of building vessels not as grand ladies of the sea, but as necessary tools for survival. He speaks of welding instead of riveting, of assembling pieces like a child's toy, of bringing ordinary citizens in from the farms to build the impossible. He speaks with a quiet, burning passion, laying his heart bare on the polished oak. He tells them of the mothers waiting by radios, of the lonely sailors shivering in the dark. He pleads with them to see that the old rules no longer apply, because the world is bleeding out while they wait for tradition to run its slow, elegant course. The response is not anger. It is not shouting. It is something far more devastating. It is a gentle, patronizing smile. It is the soft, dismissive sigh of an expert who believes they are talking to a foolish child. The admirals fold their hands together, looking at Henry with a mixture of pity and mild annoyance. They explain, in soft, murmuring voices, that what he is proposing is a fantasy. They tell him that ships built by farmers will crack in half at the first sign of a storm. They tell him that welding is unproven, that his assembly lines belong in an automobile factory, not a shipyard. They speak in whispers, But those whispers carry the crushing weight of absolute, immovable authority. It is a lovely dream, they tell him, their voices smooth and even. But the sea does not care for dreams. It requires time. It requires patience. We appreciate your patriotism, but leave the shipbuilding to the shipbuilders. And with a soft, final click, the heavy mahogany doors are closed. Henry finds himself back out on the street. The evening has brought a cold, sweeping rain that darkens the stone facades of the Capitol buildings and turns the paved roads into slick, reflective rivers. He pulls up the collar of his heavy wool coat, but he cannot keep out the chill that has settled deep inside his chest. This is the hidden burden of those who try to catch a falling world. The most painful wounds are not always suffered on the battlefield, they are often suffered in the quiet moments of absolute rejection, when you realize that the people holding the power would rather lose gracefully than win by breaking the rules. He walks slowly through the rain-slicked streets, the street lamps casting long, lonely shadows across the wet pavement. For the first time, a profound wave of exhaustion washes over him. It is a terrible, isolating feeling to hold a lifeline in your hands, to know with absolute certainty that it can save thousands of souls, only to have the gatekeepers of the world batted away with a polite, indifferent hand. He stops under the flickering awning of a small, quiet cafe. The rain taps a gentle, erratic rhythm against the canvas. He watches the raindrops fall into the puddles, small, chaotic ripples disturbing the still water. He thinks about quitting. It would be so easy. He could return to his dams, his roads, his concrete. He could let the men of the brass handle their own war. He could sleep deeply again, free from the haunting ghosts of the sailors he is trying to save. But as he stands there in the damp, lonely evening, a young man steps out of the cafe. He is wearing the dark, heavy wool uniform of a sailor, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The boy is young, impossibly young, his face pale and tight with an unspoken anxiety. He is just a kid, really, a kid who should be worried about school dances and summer harvests, not the freezing depths of a hostile ocean. The boy stops, adjusting his heavy bag in the rain, and catches Henry's eye. He doesn't know who Henry is. He doesn't know about the blueprints or the mahogany doors or the impossible promises. He just sees an older man standing in the cold. The young sailor offers a small, fragile, brave smile. He nods his head respectfully, tips his white cap, and walks away into the dark, wet night, heading toward the trains, heading toward the water. Henry watches him disappear into the shadows. The quiet despair that had been threatening to drown him suddenly vanishes, replaced by a deep, glowing ember of pure, unshakable resolve. The brass in their warm, dry offices did not see that boy. They only saw numbers on a page. They only saw the slow, steady ticking of their antique clocks. But Henry saw the beating heart of a generation walking toward the edge of the world. He realizes in that quiet, rainy moment that he does not need the permission of the brass. History is not written by those who simply guard the gates, it is written by those who find a way around them. If the marble halls will not listen, he will take his dream directly to the mud. He will take it to the people. So much of what truly happened during these heavy, desperate years was kept hidden behind those heavy wooden doors. The history we are often taught is the polished, sanitized version, the version where the experts are always right, and the path to victory is neat and orderly. But the truth is so much more human, so much more messy and raw. If you are someone who yearns to step past the velvet ropes of history, to see the unvarnished, raw reality of these quiet, desperate struggles, I have created a sanctuary just for you. Through my Patreon, we gather as a deep-dive community of history lovers. There, I share free, full-length podcasts, and we explore the raw, unblurred sections of history that are often too real, too heavy, or too honest to be shared anywhere else. It is a quiet place to truly understand the human cost of the past. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Later that night, Henry sits alone in a small, sparsely furnished hotel room. The room smells of old dust and faded floral wallpaper. A single, amber lamp burns on the bedside table, casting a warm, defiant circle of light against the encroaching dark. He does not throw his blueprints away. He takes them out of his coat, the edges slightly curled and damp from the rain. He lays them flat on the small, scratched wooden desk. He smooths out the wrinkles with the palms of his hands. The gentle, dismissive whispers of the admiral still echo in his ears, a ghost of doubt trying to haunt his quiet room. But he closes his eyes and listens harder. He pushes past the polished voices of the brass. He listens for the sound of the wind sweeping across the empty mudflats. He listens for the imagined hum of 1,000 welding torches sparking to life in the twilight. He listens for the footsteps of the weary farmers, the bakers, the school teachers, all walking toward the shoreline, ready to build a miracle with their bare hands. He takes a deep, slow breath, inhaling the quiet air of the lonely room. The men of the brass had their rules, their traditions, their elegant timelines. But Henry had something infinitely more powerful. He had the desperate, beautiful resilience of the ordinary human spirit. He carefully folds his blueprints, tucking them safely back into his pocket. He is done asking for permission from men who have forgotten how to dream. He turns off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into a soft, restful darkness. Tomorrow, he will leave the city of marble and polished oak. Tomorrow, he will return to the earth, to the dust, and to the sea. The gentle whispers of doubt have faded away, leaving behind only the quiet, steady rhythm of a promise that is finally ready to be kept. The earth always remembers the quiet weight of our first, uncertain steps. Before the sparks began to fly, before the massive steel plates were lowered from the sky, there was only the cold, unyielding shoreline and the slow, heavy rhythm of people walking into the unknown. We often picture the shipyards as they were at their peak, roaring engines of industry, mountains of gray metal, and a sky filled with the smoke of progress. But miracles do not begin with a roar. They begin with a whisper. They begin with the soft, squelching sound of worn leather boots stepping into wet clay. Imagine a pale, misty morning. The sun has not yet crested the horizon, and the world is painted in soft, bruised shades of purple and charcoal. A coastal fog clings to the ground, thick and damp, carrying the bitter, ancient scent of the ocean. Through this heavy mist, a quiet procession is moving. They are not soldiers. They are not naval architects, and they are certainly not the polished men of the brass. They are the hidden heartbeat of a desperate nation. Watch them as they arrive at the edge of the water. They step off crowded, rattling buses and emerge from the backs of dusty pickup trucks. They carry battered cardboard suitcases tied with twine and dented tin lunch pails that rattle softly in the morning chill. They wear heavy wool coats that smell faintly of mothballs and flat caps pulled low against the biting wind. Take a moment to look at their hands. These are not the hands of shipbuilders. You see the calloused, soil-stained hands of a farmer from the plains, a man whose crops withered in the dust, seeking a new way to coax life from the earth. You see the soft, ink-stained fingers of a schoolteacher who gently closed her classroom door, trading the comforting rustle of chalk for the heavy, greasy promise of industry. You see bakers, clerks, and barbers. You see grandfathers who fought in older, forgotten wars, and young men whose eyes are wide with the terrifying thrill of leaving home for the very first time. They stand together on the muddy flats, shivering slightly in the damp air. Before them lies nothing but a vast, empty expanse of mud, stretching out toward the gray, restless waters of the bay. There are no grand buildings. There are no slipways. There is only the earth, and the impossible promise that from this mud, they will pull a fleet of steel sanctuaries. Let us stand beside an older man named Arthur. He has the weathered, deeply lined face of someone who has spent his entire life looking up at the sky, waiting for rain. His hands are thrust deep into the pockets of his worn coat. He is far from his quiet farm, far from the rolling fields of wheat he knows so well. But he is here because his youngest son is out there, somewhere on the dark, freezing ocean. Arthur doesn't know anything about blueprints or hydrodynamics. He only knows that every time the wind howls at night, he pictures his boy shivering on a metal deck. He is standing in the mud today because he wants to build a wall of steel between his son and the deep, hungry sea. He feels a quiet, heavy knot of fear in his chest, but as he looks around at the strangers standing shoulder to shoulder with him in the mist, that fear begins to soften into something else. It softens into a shared, silent resolve. Next to him stands a woman named Eleanor. Until last week, she was a librarian in a quiet, sleepy town. She is used to the hushed, comforting silence of reading rooms and the delicate scent of old paper. Now, she is wearing her brother's heavy boots, which are 2 sizes too large, and a thick canvas jacket. The damp cold is seeping into her toes, and the sheer, empty vastness of the muddy shore is terrifying. She clutches her small lunch tin like a lifeline. In these early, fragile hours, there is no grand machinery to do the heavy lifting. The birth of the shipyard is intensely, intimately human. It begins with shovels and pickaxes. It begins with backs bent in quiet, grueling labor, digging the massive basins into the earth where the ships will eventually be born. The work is agonizing. The wet clay is thick and heavy, clinging to their boots like glue, fighting them for every inch of progress. Arthur swings his pickaxe, the muscles in his back protesting, but he finds a rhythm. It is the same rhythm he used to chop wood for the winter fire. Back home. He thinks of his son with every strike of the iron against the earth. Eleanor is handed a shovel. Her soft hands, used to turning delicate pages, quickly bloom with painful, red blisters. Her shoulders ache within the first hour. She wants to cry out from the sheer physical shock of it all. But then she looks over and sees a young boy, barely out of high school, struggling to push a heavy wheelbarrow through the muck. Without a word, Eleanor steps forward, placing her raw hands beside his on the wooden handles, and together, they push through the mud. It is in these quiet, unseen moments that the true foundation of the shipyard is poured. It is not made of concrete, it is made of small, everyday acts of grace. When the mid-morning break arrives, the fog has lifted slightly, revealing a pale, watery sun. The workers sit on overturned crates and wooden planks, trying to rest their trembling legs. The air is filled with the soft, metallic clicks of lunchboxes opening. Arthur sees Eleanor rubbing her blistered hands, a silent tear mixing with the dirt on her cheek. He reaches into his bag and pulls out a dented, plaid thermos. He pours a cup of steaming, black coffee into the metal lid and gently holds it out to her. She looks up, her eyes meeting his. He doesn't say a word about the pain, or the cold, or the impossible mountain of work still ahead of them. He just offers a warm, kind smile. She takes the cup, the heat radiating through her chilled fingers, and in that simple, shared warmth, they cease to be a farmer and a librarian. They become something unbroken. They become a family forged in the mud. These everyday people were stepping out of their safe, quiet lives because they understood the profound darkness that was sweeping across the globe. Even though they were far from the front lines, they felt the raw, harsh reality of the war. They knew that the gentle world they loved was hanging by a delicate thread, and they were willing to face the grueling elements to protect it. So much of that raw, unpolished reality of the war is hidden from us today. The history we consume is often sanitized, smoothed over by time and distance. But if you are someone who wants to truly understand the unvarnished truth, to see the harsh, uncensored realities that brave men and women faced during those dark years, I want to share something meaningful with you. I have a digital collection on Gumroad featuring unseen, raw images and videos of the war, materials that are simply too restricted and unfiltered to show on this platform. It is a profound, respectful look into the true grit of the era. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the afternoon sun begins to dip below the horizon, the sky turns a brilliant, burning orange. The endless expanse of mud has been transformed. It is deeply scarred, crisscrossed with trenches and the massive, hollowed-out shapes of the dry docks. The workers are covered head to toe in the gray clay. It is in their hair, under their fingernails, baked into the fabric of their coats. They are more exhausted than they have ever been in their entire lives. Every joint aches, every muscle screams in quiet protest. Yet, as they begin the slow, heavy walk back to the buses, there is a strange, beautiful lightness in their steps. They look back at the torn earth. To anyone else, it would just look like a messy, muddy field. But they can see the ghosts of the ships waiting in the hollows. They have carved a cradle for the future with their own bare hands. Night falls over the coastal towns, and the boarding houses and canvas tents begin to glow with the soft, yellow light of bedside lamps. Eleanor sits on the edge of a narrow, lumpy mattress. She has scrubbed the mud from her face, but her hands are still stained and sore. She takes out a piece of pale blue stationery and a fountain pen. She rests the paper on a borrowed magazine and begins to write a letter to her sister back home. She does not write about the aching in her bones or the biting wind. She writes about the smell of the ocean. She writes about the kindness of a stranger who offered her coffee in the cold. She writes about the strange, beautiful realization that her small, tired hands are helping to shape the very history of the world. Down the hall, Arthur sits in an old armchair, gently rubbing his knees. He holds a photograph of his son in his rough, cracked hands. He traces the boy's smiling face with a dirt-stained thumb. He whispers a quiet prayer into the stillness of the room, a promise that he will be back in the mud tomorrow, and the day after that, and every single day until the boy in the photograph comes safely home. Outside, the shipyard is entirely still. The moon rises, casting a silvery, peaceful glow over the deep basins and the mounds of excavated earth. The wind whispers softly across the flats, drying the wet clay, hardening it into stone. If you were to walk along that empty shore in the dead of night, you would see them perfectly preserved in the moonlight. Thousands upon thousands of footprints pressed deep into the earth. They are the beautiful, overlapping traces of teachers and farmers, clerks and grandfathers. They are the quiet, undeniable proof that when the world asks for the impossible, ordinary hearts will always answer the call. The earth remembers. And from these humble, muddy footprints, a sanctuary of steel is about to rise. There is a secret magic in the fading light, a brief, beautiful pause before the heavy curtain of night falls over the world. As the sun begins its slow, golden descent toward the horizon, the harsh edges of the day begin to soften. The world exhales. The muddy earth, deeply scarred by the relentless digging of the morning, is painted in gentle, soothing shades of indigo and violet. The restless ocean breeze slows to a quiet, steady whisper, cooling the tired brows of those who have labored through the afternoon. But here, on this transformed shoreline, the twilight does not signal the end of the day. It signals a beautiful, luminous beginning. The heavy pieces of the puzzle have finally arrived. Massive, silent plates of steel rest on the timber blocks, looking like sleeping giants waiting to be woken. They are cold to the touch, raw and unyielding. In the old world, these plates would have been slowly, painstakingly overlapped and joined by the deafening percussion of rivet guns, a violent, ear-shattering chorus that spoke of brute force. But Henry's dream was different. He did not want to beat the steel into submission. He wanted to stitch it together. He wanted to weave the metal just as gently as one might weave a tapestry, melting the edges until they became a single, unbreakable skin. He wanted to use the quiet, searing power of light. And to do this, he did not call upon hardened ironworkers. He called upon those who already knew the quiet art of stitching things together. Let us stand in the cool evening shadows and watch a woman named Margaret. A few months ago, Margaret's world was wonderfully small and fiercely protected. Her days were measured by the soft, rhythmic hum of a sewing machine in the sunlit corner of her parlor. She knew the delicate language of cotton and silk. She knew how to guide a tiny, silver needle through fragile fabrics to make a dress for her daughter, or to mend the frayed collar of her husband's favorite shirt. Her hands were gentle, her movements precise and light. Now, her husband is somewhere far away, carried by the very ocean that she looks out upon. His absence is a quiet ache in her chest, a hollow space she tries to fill with purposeful hands. Tonight, Margaret is not holding a delicate needle, and she is not surrounded by the scent of lavender and pressed linen. She is wearing heavy, stiff leather overalls that bunch awkwardly at her knees. She wears thick, insulated gloves that make her small fingers feel delightfully clumsy. The air around her smells intensely of ozone, of hot dust, and of the sea. She stands before a towering wall of steel, two plates resting flush against each other. In her heavy, gloved hand, she holds a welding stinger, a heavy cable trailing behind it like the tail of a dormant dragon. At the end of the stinger is a slender, flux-coated rod. She is terrified. It is a quiet, fluttering fear, like a moth trapped against a window pane. She has been told that she is about to hold a lightning bolt in her hand. She has been told that the heat she will create is hotter than the surface of the sun. It seems impossible that she, a mother, a homemaker, a woman who cries at sentimental radio shows, could harness such an elemental force. Beside her stands an older foreman. His face is weathered, deeply creased by decades of working in the elements, but his eyes are infinitely kind. He does not shout. He does not hurry her. He understands the profound courage it takes for her to simply stand there. Just like tracing a line on paper, Maggie, he whispers, his voice a comforting rumble in the evening air. Nice and slow. Let the heat do the work. You're just guiding the river. Margaret nods. She takes a deep, trembling breath, pulling the cool, salty air deep into her lungs. She reaches up and pulls down her heavy fiberglass hood. The moment the mask falls into place, the world outside entirely vanishes. It is a sudden, absolute sensory deprivation. The dimming light of the evening is replaced by pitch, impenetrable blackness through the dark filter of the viewing glass. The sound of the wind, the distant calling of the gulls, the murmuring of the other workers, all of it becomes muffled and distant. Inside the hood, she is entirely alone. She can hear the rhythmic, comforting sound of her own breathing echoing softly in the enclosed space. It is a quiet, deeply intimate sanctuary. In this darkness, she is not just a worried wife or a frightened novice. She is a guardian. She is about to build the walls that will bring the boys home. She steps forward, finding her balance, leaning into the heavy leather apron. She lowers the tip of the rod toward the invisible seam in the dark. She strikes it against the steel, just like lighting a match. SSSSHHH crack. In an instant, the utter darkness is shattered by a brilliant, mesmerizing star. It is a light so pure, so intensely blue and white, that it seems to sing. Through the heavy, protective glass of her helmet, the blinding glare is tamed into a beautiful, glowing miniature sun. The sudden heat radiates against her thick leathers, wrapping her in a sudden, comforting warmth against the evening chill. The sound it makes is not a violent roar. It is a steady, rhythmic sizzle, like the comforting sound of bacon frying in a Sunday morning kitchen, or the gentle crackle of a warm hearth fire. Margaret watches, entranced, as the hard, unyielding steel beneath her rod suddenly turns to liquid. It becomes a glowing, golden puddle of molten honey. Her fear entirely melts away into that puddle. With small, careful, deliberate movements of her wrist, she begins to weave the rod back and forth. She is sewing. It is exactly like sewing. She guides the glowing puddle along the seam, dragging the liquid light with her, watching the two massive plates of steel blend and fuse into one unbroken surface. Beneath the protective shell of slag, the metal is cooling, locking together with a strength that defies the ocean itself. A profound, beautiful realization washes over her in the dark of her helmet. She is powerful. Her small, delicate hands are taming fire and melting iron. She imagines that every inch of steel she binds together is a protective shield, an impenetrable armor she is personally wrapping around her husband, wherever he may be. She pours her love, her longing, and her quiet, fierce hope into the glowing weld. When she finally lifts her rod and flips her hood back up, the sudden rush of cool night air kisses her flushed cheeks. The puddle she left behind is glowing a dull, angry cherry red in the twilight, slowly fading to a deep, bruised purple, and finally to a solid, ashen gray. She reaches out with a gloved finger and traces the warm, rippled seam. It is perfect. It is strong. It is hers. The older foreman places a gentle hand on her shoulder and nods, a soft smile playing on his lips. Margaret smiles back, a radiant, triumphant smile that rivals the spark she just created. There is such a profound, visual beauty in these moments of quiet resilience. The sight of everyday heroes shaping history with their own hands creates images that linger deeply in our hearts. It is this very imagery that draws us so closely to the stories of the past. We long to see it, to feel it, and to hold those memories close. When we watch the grand, sweeping stories of the Pacific Fleet unfold on our screens, or when we look for tangible pieces of that era to connect with, we are searching for the very sparks those men and women ignited. If you find yourself wanting to immerse deeper into that visual history, I highly recommend browsing Amazon for beautiful WWII memorabilia, or sitting down to watch the incredible movie Midway on Prime, which paints such a vivid picture of the sheer scale of the ocean they were trying to conquer. It is a wonderful way to honor their journey. But please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As Margaret stands there, catching her breath, another blue spark ignites a few dozen yards down the line. It lights up the face of a young grocery clerk, his brow furrowed in deep concentration behind his glass window. Then, another spark catches further down. And another. Like fireflies waking up in a summer meadow, the shipyard begins to bloom with brilliant, staccato bursts of blue and white light. The twilight deepens into a velvety, star-streaked night, but the shoreline is alive with its own terrestrial constellation. The air fills with the collective, soothing sizzle of 100 arcs striking in unison. It becomes a steady, rhythmic hum, a lullaby of industry, a symphony of fire and focus. The smell of the ocean breeze is now forever intertwined with the sharp, clean scent of hot metal and burned flux. When the midnight brake whistle softly blows, the sparks temporarily vanish, plunging the yard back into a peaceful, moonlit calm. The workers, covered in a fine layer of dark soot, gather together on overturned buckets and wooden crates. They lift their heavy hoods, revealing faces that are exhausted but remarkably peaceful. Margaret sits with a group of women who, just weeks ago, were strangers. They share a large, dented thermos of sweet, hot tea. They don't talk about the grand strategies of the war. They don't discuss the grim news from the front. Instead, they share the quiet comforts of home. They talk about the recipes they miss cooking. They trade tips on how to coax the stubborn grease from underneath their fingernails. One woman, a former schoolteacher, pulls a crumpled, much-read letter from her pocket and reads a funny story her young son wrote to her. The women laugh, a soft, musical sound that drifts up toward the stars, momentarily chasing away the heavy shadows of the world. In these quiet hours of the night, sharing warm tea and gentle laughter in the glow of the cooling steel, they are finding a profound sanctuary. They are no longer isolated individuals waiting anxiously by silent radios. They belong to something larger than themselves. They have found a sisters-in-arms camaraderie, bound together not by the tragedy of the times, but by the shared, empowering heat of the torch. As the break ends, they stand up, stretching their tired backs. They pull their heavy leather gloves back on, the material now feeling like a second skin. They adjust their heavy hoods, offering each other quiet nods of encouragement. One by one, the blue stars return to the shoreline. If you were to sail past that coastline in the deep, dark hours of the early morning, you would not see a muddy, desperate struggle. You would see a magnificent ribbon of light stretching along the edge of the water. You would see the beautiful, defiant glow of a nation mending its broken heart with pure, liquid fire. The ship is no longer just a collection of cold, disconnected pieces. Because of the gentle, determined hands of people like Margaret, the steel is finding its voice. It is becoming whole. And in the warm, protecting light of those countless sparks, a true miracle is quietly taking shape in the dark. There is a quiet miracle that happens when absolute chaos finally surrenders and slowly becomes a heartbeat. If you were to stand at the edge of the shipyard on your very first day, the world would seem overwhelming. You would hear 100 different sounds colliding in the cold, salt-tinged air. The heavy clanging of metal plates settling against one another. The sharp, sudden hiss of steam escaping from pressure valves. The deep, rumbling growl of massive diesel engines turning over in the morning frost. To a stranger, it is a deafening, tangled wall of noise. But if you stay long enough, if you close your eyes and simply listen to the pulse of the yard, the noise begins to change. The sharp edges wear away. The disparate sounds begin to weave themselves together, finding a strange, beautiful harmony. The clinking of wrenches becomes a steady percussion. The low hum of the generators becomes a sustained, warm chord. The sudden flares of the welding torches become the bright, rhythmic accents of a grand, sweeping melody. It becomes a symphony of steel. And the musicians playing this magnificent song are everyday people who have found a family in the most unlikely of places. Imagine the shipyard just before dawn. The sky is the color of deep, bruised plum, and a gentle mist rolls off the dark water of the bay, wrapping the towering cranes in soft, gray ribbons. The air is bitterly cold, the kind of damp chill that seeps through heavy wool and settles deep into the bones. Through this mist, a river of humanity flows through the iron gates. Thousands of souls, side by side, walking with a shared purpose. They are bundled in thick coats, their breath pluming in the freezing air like small, white clouds. Let us walk beside a young man named Thomas. Thomas grew up in the deep, quiet warmth of the rural South. He had never felt the biting sting of ocean frost before he boarded a crowded train, carrying his life savings in a worn leather satchel, heading west toward the promise of a fair wage and a chance to do his part. He is far from the rustling pecan trees and the warm, familiar porch of his childhood home. The sheer size of the massive steel plates towering above him makes him feel wonderfully small, but also terribly lonely. He finds his way to his station, his hands numb inside his stiff canvas gloves. He is a shipfitter's helper, tasked with holding the heavy metal brackets perfectly still while the welders stitch them into place. It is exhausting, bone-aching work that requires a quiet, intense trust between two people. The welder he is assigned to is an older man named Elias. Elias is an immigrant who spent his youth laying bricks for city buildings that he would never be allowed to live in. His face is a map of deep lines, weathered by decades of hard labor, and his hands are as thick and rough as the bark of an ancient oak tree. Thomas and Elias come from entirely different worlds. If they had passed each other on a city street in peacetime, they likely would never have spoken. They do not share the same background, the same history, or the same quiet sorrows. But here, beneath the looming shadow of the ship's rising hull, none of that matters. The heavy grease that coats their faces by mid-morning is a great, gentle equalizer. It paints them in the same shades of charcoal and ash. As the morning whistle blows, a soft, mournful note that echoes across the water, Elias reaches into his battered tin lunchbox. He pulls out a glass thermos, the cork stopper slightly chipped. He unscrews the lid, pours a cup of steaming, dark coffee, and without a word, holds it out to Thomas. Thomas takes it, the heat of the metal cup warming his freezing palms. He looks at Elias, and the older man simply nods, his eyes crinkling at the corners with a silent, fatherly warmth. They do not need to speak. The shared warmth of the coffee and the freezing mist says everything that needs to be said. It says, I see you. It says, we are in this together. It says, I will keep you safe while the sparks fly. This quiet, unspoken bond blooms all across the yard. Women who once hosted delicate afternoon teas now stand shoulder to shoulder with women who spent their lives scrubbing floors, together maneuvering heavy steel plates with the synchronized grace of a ballet. Men who were rival grocers in their hometowns now pull on the same heavy ropes, timing their breaths to heave as one. They share everything. They share their rations of sugar and bread. They share the worn, dog-eared newspapers from home. They share the quiet, agonizing wait for the mailman. When the mail finally arrives, the yard takes a brief, collective breath. Thomas sits on an overturned wooden crate during his lunch break, carefully opening a letter from his mother. The thin paper smells faintly of dried lavender, a scent that instantly transports him away from the harsh smells of ozone and diesel, carrying him back to the warm, sunlit kitchen of his youth. He reads her elegant, looping handwriting, her words full of gentle concern and unwavering pride. She tells him that the garden is blooming, that the dog still waits by the front gate for him to come home, and that she prays every night for the boys on the water, and for the boy building the ships. Elias sits beside him, quietly eating a simple sandwich. He doesn't ask what the letter says, but he gently rests his heavy hand on Thomas's shoulder for just a moment. It is a small, passing touch, but it carries the weight of immense comfort. It is an anchor keeping Thomas tethered when the homesickness threatens to pull him away. This beautiful, hidden world of shared kindness and quiet resilience was the true engine of the shipyard. The history books often focus on the grand numbers, the tonnage of steel, the brilliant engineering of the blueprints. But the real strength of those vessels was forged in the unseen shadows of the massive hulls. It was woven from the personal, hidden stories of the people who built them. So much of the courage that changed the course of the world happened completely out of sight. Behind the loud, public narratives of the war, there was a quiet, shadow world of profound dedication and hidden operations. There were stories of unseen heroes, deeply kept secrets, and silent victories that the world at large was never meant to know. If you find yourself drawn to these hidden depths of history, to the quiet mysteries and the forgotten people who shaped our world from the shadows, I would love to share a special piece of that history with you. Through my email newsletter, I send out a beautifully crafted, free ebook called The Shadow War, 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II. It is a gentle, fascinating journey into the unseen courage of the era, exploring the deep cover secrets that history almost forgot. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the afternoon sun begins to arc across the sky, painting the shipyard in warm, amber light, the rhythm of the work reaches its most beautiful crescendo. Look up into the sky. The massive, gentle giants of the yard, the towering cranes, are moving with a slow, sweeping elegance. High up in the small, glass-enclosed cabins, the operators sit like quiet conductors, gently pulling levers and coaxing the heavy cables. They are lowering a massive section of the ship's bow into place. It weighs hundreds of tons, yet it descends from the heavens with the delicacy of a falling feather. Down below, Thomas, Elias, and dozens of others stand ready. They look up, raising their hands toward the descending steel as if greeting a descending angel. There is a moment of profound, held breath. The music of the yard seems to pause. With quiet murmurs and gentle pushes, the workers guide the massive plate. It slides perfectly into the cradle they have built for it. The heavy steel meets the rest of the hull with a deep, resonant thud, a sound that vibrates through the soles of their boots and settles deep into their chests. It is the heartbeat. The ship is no longer just pieces of metal, it is taking on a soul. Immediately, the blue and white sparks of the welders' torches bloom around the new seam, stitching the ship together with liquid fire. Thomas holds his bracket steady, feeling the intense, comforting heat radiating through his heavy leathers. Elias strikes his arc, his movements smooth and practiced, weaving the molten steel with the care of a master artist. They work in an unspoken rhythm, a perfect, synchronized dance. Thomas anticipates Elias's movements before they happen. Elias trusts Thomas to hold the line. They are an extension of one another, bound together by the symphony of the yard. When the evening whistle finally blows, a long, low, soothing note that signals the end of the shift, the sparks slowly die out. The heavy engines are shut down, their rumble fading into a gentle sigh. The silence that rushes back in is not empty, it is full of a deep, satisfying peace. Thomas and Elias pack away their tools, their bodies aching with the good, honest tiredness of a day deeply lived. They walk together toward the gates, part of the massive, slow-moving river of weary men and women heading home. They look back over their shoulders at the shipyard. In the gathering dusk, illuminated by the soft, yellow glow of the security lights, the ship looks breathtaking. Its sweeping, graceful lines rise up from the earth, a monument to their collective will. It is a sanctuary made of steel, born from the mud, shaped by the hands of strangers who became a family. Thomas pulls his coat tighter against the evening chill, but the cold doesn't bother him anymore. He feels a profound warmth radiating from the center of his chest. It is the lingering rhythm of the yard, the gentle, steady heartbeat of the work they have done. He walks into the quiet night, the symphony still playing softly in his mind, lulling him toward a deep, dreamless sleep, knowing that tomorrow, the music will begin all over again. Even the strongest steel cannot keep out the chill of a heartbreak arriving at the front door. When the massive, gentle ships were resting on their blocks in the cool evening air, and the exhausted workers were finally closing their heavy eyes in quiet boarding houses, the ocean was still awake. It is a terrifying, beautiful thing to realize that the sea never truly sleeps. Far out in the deep, freezing expanse of the Atlantic, beneath a moon that offered no warmth, the invisible war continued to rage in absolute, suffocating silence. While the shipyard was learning to sing its beautiful symphony of creation, the waters far away were quietly humming a much darker tune. It was a tune of shadows slipping beneath the whitecaps, of sudden, terrible fractures in the night, and of good, gentle men who simply wanted to come home. There is a profound, heavy pause that comes with war. It is not the loud, chaotic noise of the front lines, but the terrible, breathless waiting that happens back home. It is the silence of a kitchen table where one chair sits painfully empty. It is the quiet tick of a clock in a dark hallway, echoing through a house that suddenly feels far too large. Slowly, heartbreakingly, the reality of the dark ocean began to wash ashore, creeping into the sleepy, tree-lined neighborhoods and the bustling, muddy avenues of the coastal towns. It did not arrive with a siren or a grand announcement. It arrived on two thin bicycle tires, pedaled by quiet, solemn young men wearing small caps and carrying a leather satchel full of yellow envelopes. Imagine a quiet Tuesday morning. The sun is shining, catching the dew on the manicured lawns. The world feels soft and safe. But then, the gentle whir of the bicycle chain is heard on the street. Curtains twitch. Mothers holding dish towels freeze by their sinks, their hearts suddenly trapped like hummingbirds against their ribs. They watch the young messenger step off his bike, his face pale and heavy with a burden he is too young to carry. He walks up a wooden porch. He knocks, just softly. And then, a sound that no neighborhood can ever unhear. A sudden, sharp intake of breath, followed by a weeping so deep, so completely hollow, that it seems to pull the very light out of the morning sky. The yellow telegram flutters to the porch floor, carrying a few typed, devastating words that have just ended an entire universe. This was the unseen toll. The ghosts of the deep were reaching out, touching the shoulders of the families who had offered up their brightest lights to the dark water. In the shipyard, the grief did not stay at the gates. It seeped into the mud. It climbed up the scaffolding. It settled into the heavy, protective leather coats of the men and women working the line. Let us sit quietly with a woman named Clara. Clara is a welder on the night shift. Her hands are burned and calloused, her face perpetually smudged with the gray ash of her trade. She works through the darkest hours of the night, guided only by the brilliant, blooming stars of her welding torch. Clara has a son named James. James has soft, kind eyes and a laugh that used to fill their small home with absolute sunshine. Now, James is out there, somewhere in the freezing swell, serving on a merchant ship carrying medicine and blankets through the shadow war. Every night, when the break whistle blows its low, mournful sigh, Clara does not gather with the other women to share hot tea and stories. She finds a quiet, hidden corner beneath the massive curve of the steel hull. She sits on a wooden crate, pulling her heavy coat tight against the sea breeze. From her deep pocket, she carefully pulls out a stack of letters. The paper is incredibly soft now, worn down by the constant touch of her anxious fingers. She turns on a small, brass flashlight, shielding the beam with her gloved hand so it casts only a tiny, amber pool of light onto the pages. She reads his words over and over. James writes about the stars he sees from the deck, how they look exactly like the ones they used to watch from their back porch. He writes about a funny stray dog the crew adopted, and how the cook makes a terrible, wonderful stew out of canned vegetables. He writes to protect her. He fills his letters with mundane, gentle things so that she will not see the terror hiding in the margins. But Clara is a mother. She can hear the unspoken fears resting quietly between his cheerful sentences. She can feel the icy spray of the ocean against his face. She reads the letters by the flickering light, her tears tracing clean, pale lines down her soot-stained cheeks, falling softly onto the fragile paper. She is not alone in the shadows. All across the immense shipyard, in the quiet, stolen moments of the night, people are reading old letters. A young wife traces the signature of her husband with a trembling thumb. An older man rereads a note from his grandson, his jaw tight with unshed tears. They are all holding onto these fragile pieces of paper as if they were lifelines thrown into the deep. Then, one evening, the rhythm of the yard abruptly stops. It happens on the framing deck. A foreman, a large, gentle man who usually bellows with a booming, cheerful laugh, is approached by a messenger. He takes a piece of paper. He reads it. Slowly, his heavy shoulders collapse, as if invisible weights have been dropped upon him. He drops his clipboard. It clatters against the steel deck, a sharp, shocking sound in the sudden quiet. His youngest brother's ship had gone down in the night. The silence that ripples out from that moment is absolute. The welding torches are turned off, one by one. The massive cranes halt their slow, graceful dance. The hammers fall still. Thousands of workers turn toward the foreman, an ocean of grease-stained faces watching a profound, intimate tragedy unfold beneath the floodlights. There are no grand speeches. There is no swelling music. There is only the wind coming off the bay, and the soft, collective sorrow of a family who understands exactly what has been lost. It is a heavy, sacred thing to reach back into the past and gently uncover these moments of quiet heartbreak. The grand, sweeping histories of the world rarely pause to notice the tear-stained letters read by flashlight or the silent grief of a foreman standing on a cold steel deck. Finding these deeply human stories, brushing away the dust of decades to let their quiet courage shine again, takes countless hours of careful, loving research. If you find comfort in these deeply personal journeys, and if you would like to help support the massive amount of time it takes to gently craft and preserve these forgotten memories, I have set up a small Ko-Fi tip jar. Even the smallest token of support allows me to continue unearthing these beautiful, fragile lives, ensuring they are never truly lost to the deep. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. In that profound, terrible silence on the framing deck, something entirely beautiful began to happen. The foreman, his eyes glassy and staring out at nothing, slowly bent down. His hands were trembling, but he picked up his dropped clipboard. He took a long, shuddering breath, filling his lungs with the cold night air. Beside him, an older worker reached out and placed a gentle, steadying hand on his shoulder. Then another worker stepped forward, picking up her heavy welding cables. Without a word, Clara pulled her thick leather hood down over her face. SSSSHHH crack. A single, brilliant blue star ignited in the dark. Then another. And another. Within minutes, the shipyard was roaring back to life, but the energy had entirely shifted. It was no longer just an industrial miracle, it was a desperate, quiet prayer. It was a rescue mission. The grief did not break them. It crystallized them. The workers looked out at the dark, rolling water of the bay, and they no longer just saw the ocean. They saw the enemy. They realized with a terrifying, absolute clarity that every single second they lost was a heartbeat slipping away into the icy depths. Every hour the ships remained unfinished was another yellow envelope waiting to be delivered. The pace of the yard accelerated, but not out of panic. It accelerated out of a profound, agonizing love. The heavy metal plate seemed to move faster, guided by hands that refused to rest. The symphony of the yard grew louder, more urgent, more fiercely determined. Muscles ached, fingers bled, and eyes burned with exhaustion, but nobody walked away. When their shifts ended, workers would simply find a quiet corner to sleep for a few hours before picking up their tools and rejoining the line. They were not just building ships anymore. They were building lifeboats for the world. Clara stood before the massive wall of steel, weaving her liquid fire across the seams. She no longer felt the biting cold of the wind. She poured every ounce of a mother's fierce, protective love into the glowing metal. With every inch of steel she fused together, she whispered a quiet promise into the dark of her helmet. She promised the ocean that it would not have her boy. She promised the ghosts of the deep that she would build a sanctuary strong enough to bring them all home. The ships rising from the mud began to look less like machines, and more like enormous, unyielding shields. The workers ran their gloved hands over the cooling welds, patting the steel as if comforting a giant, sleeping beast. They were pouring their very souls into the iron, infusing the cold metal with a warmth that the Atlantic could never freeze. The ghosts in the deep were no longer haunting them. They were guiding them. They were the invisible hands resting on the shoulders of the welders, the quiet whispers in the ears of the crane operators, the gentle wind pushing them to move faster, to reach higher, to build the impossible. And so, through the tears, through the exhausting, bone-deep sorrow, the miracle continued to grow. Out of the profound despair of the dark water, a brilliant, unbreakable light was slowly rising, forged by the beautiful, quiet resilience of everyday heroes who simply refused to let the night win. There are promises we whisper to the night, and then there are oaths we gently lay upon the breaking dawn. The shipyard had found its beautiful, steady rhythm. The desperate, panicked energy of the early days had slowly transformed into a deep, sustained pulse. Thousands of hands moved in a quiet, synchronized dance, weaving steel and light together under the soft glow of the moon. They were building ships faster than anyone had ever thought possible, pulling floating sanctuaries out of the damp earth with a fierce, quiet love. But out on the dark, restless water, the shadow war was still raging, and the ocean's hunger seemed infinite. Henry stood alone on a wooden scaffolding, high above the muddy flats, his heavy coat pulled tight against the bitter, salty wind. He looked down at the sprawling city of industry he had helped breathe into existence. He watched the brilliant blue sparks of the welders blooming like terrestrial stars. He saw the weary slump of the workers' shoulders as they carried heavy cables, their breath pluming in the freezing air. He knew their names, their stories, the quiet grief they carried in their battered tin lunchboxes. He knew they were giving absolutely everything they had. But as he looked out past the cranes, toward the black, rolling horizon of the Pacific, a heavy realization settled over his heart. Everything they had was simply not enough. The traditional rules of time, even when pushed to their absolute limits, were still too slow. The world was bleeding out, and Henry knew that to truly save it, they could no longer just bend the rules of history. They had to completely rewrite them. He walked back to his modest, quiet office. It smelled of old paper and cold coffee. A single, warm desk lamp cast a gentle pool of golden light over a scattered pile of blueprints. He sat down and looked at a calendar on the wall. The men in the marble halls of the Capitol had said it took months, sometimes years, to build a vessel of war. Henry traced his rough, dirt-stained finger across the little squares of paper. He closed his eyes and listened to the distant, soothing hum of the yard outside his window. He thought of the mothers waiting by their silent radios. He thought of the freezing boys on the swaying decks. He needed to give his workers more than just a blueprint. He needed to give them a miracle. He needed to offer the world an impossible, shining beacon of hope. He opened his eyes. He didn't look at months. He didn't look at weeks. He looked at days. 13 days. It was a ridiculous, beautiful, utterly foolish number. To build a massive, complex floating fortress, a carrier of the sea, in just 13 days was entirely beyond the realm of human reason. It was like asking a single sea to become a towering oak overnight. But Henry knew something the experts did not. He knew that when you give ordinary people an impossible dream, their quiet resilience can bend the very fabric of reality. The announcement did not come with grand fanfare. There were no brass bands or booming loudspeakers echoing across the bay. It spread through the shipyard like a gentle, warming breeze, traveling softly from person to person. A foreman whispered it to a pipefitter. A crane operator called it down to a rigger. The women on the welding line paused, lifting their heavy fiberglass hoods, passing the words down the row. 13 days. Let us sit for a moment with a man named Samuel. Samuel was an older man with silver in his hair and deep, gentle smile lines around his eyes. Before the war, he had been a watchmaker in a quiet, dusty shop filled with the soft ticking of 1,000 tiny gears. He knew the profound, unyielding nature of time. He knew that you could not force a delicate mechanism to move faster than its design allowed without breaking it. When Samuel heard the number whispered on the framing deck, he slowly set down his heavy wrench. The cold metal clinked softly against the steel deck. He took off his thick canvas gloves and rubbed his tired, calloused hands together. He looked around at the towering, incomplete ribs of the ship surrounding him, and then he looked up at the pale, overcast sky. A quiet, fluttering fear bloomed in his chest. It wasn't a fear of the work itself, it was the terrifying, heavy weight of the promise. If they tried to do this impossible thing and failed, the heartbreak would be too much to bear. The yard would lose its spirit. The magic would break. He imagined the admirals back east, shaking their heads with polite, dismissive smiles, whispering that they had warned the foolish dreamers. When the midship break arrived, Samuel did not eat his simple sandwich. He found a quiet spot out of the wind, sitting on a pile of wooden timber. He pulled out a small, worn notebook and a pencil. He began to write a letter to his daughter, who was miles away, safe in a quiet, sleeping town. He wrote to her about the cold sea air and the beautiful symphony of the cranes. And then, he wrote about the number. He poured his hidden doubts onto the paper, his handwriting small and careful. He confessed his quiet terror. He told her that he was just a tired old watchmaker, and that holding back the hands of time felt like trying to hold back the ocean tide with a broom. He wrote of his profound vulnerability, the kind of deep, human fear that we all harbor in the darkest hours of the night. It is a rare and beautiful thing to glimpse the true, hidden hearts of the people who built our world. So much of our history is polished and smoothed over, leaving only the bold triumphs and the grand declarations. The quiet fears, the tear-stained letters, the moments of profound, shaking doubt, these are often swept away into the shadows. But if you are someone who yearns to gently unearth these hidden truths, to understand the raw, unvarnished humanity of the past, I want to invite you into a quiet sanctuary we have built. Through my Patreon, we gather as a deep-dive community of history lovers. There, I share free, full-length podcasts and explore the raw, unblurred, deeply personal video sections of history that are simply too real and too heavy for a public stage. It is a place to honor the complete, beautiful truth of these lives. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Samuel folded the letter and tucked it safely into the breast pocket of his heavy coat, keeping his doubts close to his heart. He took a long, slow breath of the salt-heavy air and stood up. He walked back to his station on the framing deck. As he approached, he noticed a subtle, profound change in the atmosphere. The yard was entirely silent. The break was over, but the symphony had not yet resumed. Thousands of men and women were standing at their stations, holding their tools, looking out toward the water. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the vast, dark expanse of the ocean meeting the gray sky. They were all looking at the horizon. They were not looking with despair. They were not looking with the hollow, defeated eyes of people who had been asked to do the impossible. As Samuel watched the faces of his fellow workers, the former schoolteachers, the bakers, the farmers, the housewives, he saw a quiet, electric resolve settling over them like a warm blanket. He saw the mother who had lost her son, her jaw set with a fierce, unbreakable love. He saw the young boy from the plains, gripping his rivet gun with knuckles white from determination. They all knew it was impossible. They all knew the experts were laughing at them. But they also knew that out there, beyond the gray horizon, ordinary boys were floating in the freezing dark, waiting for a miracle. And if the world could not provide a miracle, then they would simply have to build one themselves, with their own bruised and blistered hands. Samuel felt the knot of fear in his chest gently untangle, replaced by a deep, soaring warmth. He realized that Henry had not given them a burden. He had given them a gift. He had given them the ultimate defiance against the darkness. Samuel stepped up to his heavy steel beam. He picked up his cold iron wrench. He looked over at the young woman working beside him, her face framed by the heavy fiberglass of her welding hood. He offered her a small, gentle smile, and she nodded back, a silent promise passing between them. He brought the wrench down against the steel. Clang. It was a single, clear note that rang out across the quiet yard. It was not just the sound of labor. It was a beautiful, defiant oath spoken in the language of iron. Immediately, the yard answered. Another hammer fell. A welding torch hissed into brilliant, blooming life. A diesel engine roared with a deep, warming growl. The symphony of the shipyard returned, but the tempo had changed. It was no longer just a steady, working rhythm. It was a beautiful, rushing heartbeat. It was the sound of 1,000 souls entirely united in a single, audacious dream. They were no longer just building a ship. They were racing the very turning of the earth. They were chasing the sun across the sky. As the afternoon light began to fade, turning the muddy flats into a landscape of deep purple and gold, the workers moved with a graceful, frantic beauty. They did not run, for there is no rushing the delicate art of the steel, but there was an economy to their motion, a fluid, poetic urgency in every step. They worked through the twilight, the sparks of their torches mixing with the first pale stars appearing in the night sky. Samuel felt the ache in his bones, but it was a good, honest ache. He felt the letter resting against his chest, but the doubts written on those pages felt like they belonged to another man, from another lifetime. Tonight, he was not a tired watchmaker. Tonight, he was an architect of time itself. He looked out at the dark water one last time before pulling his goggles over his eyes. The horizon was a quiet, unbroken line in the distance. The oath had been made. The impossible clock had started ticking. And under the gentle, watchful light of the moon, the workers lowered their heads, entirely ready to pull a miracle out of the mud. The heaviest burdens of the war were not always carried in the freezing mud. Sometimes they were borne in the quiet, agonizing solitude of a dimly lit room. While the massive shipyard outside roared with the symphony of steel and the brilliant blue flashes of welding torches, there was another, hidden world operating in absolute silence. It was a world entirely made of paper, graphite, and shadows. If you were to walk away from the muddy slipways, past the towering cranes, and step into the long, wooden sheds that sat at the edge of the yard, the deafening noise of construction would slowly fade into a muffled, distant hum. Here, in the drafting rooms, the air was thick, warm, and smelled deeply of roasted coffee beans, shaved cedarwood, and the sharp, clean scent of ammonia from freshly pressed blueprints. Imagine a room stretching out into the darkness, filled with row upon row of massive, slanted wooden tables. Above each table hangs a single, green-shaded lamp, casting a warm, amber pool of light onto the pristine white paper below. It is past midnight. The rest of the sleeping world is lost in dreams, but in this room, the waking dreamers are fighting a quiet, desperate battle against the relentless ticking of the clock. Let us pull up a stool beside a man named David. Before the world lost its way, David was an architect of gentle things. He lived in a quiet, sun-drenched town, and he spent his days designing wide, sweeping porches for summer homes, and bright, airy libraries where children could sit and read in the afternoon light. He was a man who believed that buildings should breathe, that lines should invite comfort and peace. Now, his collar is unbuttoned, his tie is pulled loose, and his sleeves are rolled up past his elbows. His hands, once used to sketching the delicate curves of a park gazebo, are permanently smudged with dark, gray graphite. He leans over a massive sheet of drafting paper, his eyes burning with a deep, sandy exhaustion. He has not slept a full night in weeks. The promise of 13 days is hanging in the air above him, heavy and invisible. To build a ship in 13 days, the builders out in the yard could not simply work faster. The human body has its limits. Muscle and bone can only carry so much steel before they simply give way. The secret to the miracle had to be unlocked here, on this piece of paper, before a single sheet of metal was ever cut. David was tasked with a puzzle that seemed entirely impossible. He had to figure out how to build massive, 60-ton pieces of the ship, entire deckhouses, massive sections of the hull, completely separate from the main body of the vessel. And then, he had to calculate exactly how the cranes could lift these colossal puzzle pieces into the sky, turn them gently in the air, and set them down with absolute, millimeter precision, without the sheer weight of the steel causing the entire structure to snap in half. It is a terrifying responsibility. He knows that if his calculations are wrong by even a fraction of an inch, the steel will buckle. He knows that if a piece falls, it will take the lives of the men and women standing below. He holds a thin wooden pencil between his thumb and forefinger, staring blindly at the complex web of lines and intersecting angles. The numbers begin to blur, swimming across the page like insects in the pale light. A quiet wave of despair washes over him. He drops the pencil. It rolls across the slanted board, making a soft, hollow tapping sound as it falls onto the wooden floor. He buries his face in his graphite-stained hands, rubbing his aching eyes. The silence in the room is profound, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thud of a dropped forge somewhere out in the dark, beating like the tired heart of the yard. Then, a soft shadow falls across his table. He looks up to see Mary. Mary is a young draftswoman who works 2 tables down. She wears a simple, dark blue dress, a yellow measuring tape draped around her neck like a scarf. Her hair is pinned up, though a few stray curls have fallen to frame her tired, kind face. In her hands, she holds 2 thick, ceramic mugs. A gentle ribbon of steam rises from the dark coffee. She doesn't say a word about the dropped pencil or the heavy sigh she heard from across the room. She simply sets a warm mug down near the edge of his drafting board, far away from the precious paper. It's fresh, she whispers, her voice a soft, soothing melody in the quiet room. Elias from the machine shop just brought up a new pot. Says it's strong enough to strip paint, but it's warm. David offers a small, grateful smile, picking up the mug. The heat radiates through the thick ceramic, thawing his cold fingers. He takes a slow sip. It is bitter and dark, but it brings a small, comforting spark of life back into his chest. Mary leans gently against the edge of his table, looking down at the maze of lines on his blueprint. It looks like a spiderweb that forgot how to catch a fly, she murmurs softly, a faint smile touching the corners of her mouth. David chuckles, a quiet, dusty sound. It feels like one, he admits, his voice raspy from disuse. I've run the geometry a dozen times, Mary. If we try to lift the aft deckhouse in one piece, the stress on the center bulkheads will tear it apart. The steel is too heavy. The cranes can lift it, but the piece itself won't survive the journey through the air. Mary looks at the drawing, her eyes tracking the elegant, sweeping lines David has drawn. She understands the weight he is carrying. Pinned to the small corkboard above her own desk is a photograph of her husband, a radio man on a cruiser somewhere in the Philippine Sea. Every line she draws, every calculation she checks, she does with his face resting gently in her mind. The raw truth of why David and Mary stayed awake, pushing their minds to the absolute edge of human endurance, was rooted in a reality that the public rarely saw. They knew the terrible cost of failing. They had seen the restricted photographs, the uncensored reports of what happened to the ships that didn't have enough armor, the vessels that were built too slowly to outrun the unseen terrors of the deep. It was a harsh, unforgiving truth that fueled their midnight vigils. If you are someone who wishes to understand the true, unvarnished gravity of what these quiet heroes were fighting against, to see the history that was carefully kept out of the newspapers, I want to offer you a profound resource. I have curated a digital collection on Gumroad featuring unseen, raw images and videos of the war that are simply too restricted and unfiltered to share on this platform. It is a sobering, respectful look at the harsh realities that drove everyday people to achieve miracles. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Mary reaches out and touches the edge of David's blueprint. When I was a little girl, she whispers, her eyes distant, remembering a softer time, my mother used to make these incredibly delicate pastry shells for the holidays. They were so thin, you could almost see through them. If you tried to pick one up by the edges, it would crumble into dust. David takes another sip of his coffee, listening to the gentle cadence of her voice. It is a welcome sanctuary from the cold mathematics in his head. How did she move them? He asks softly. She didn't pick them up, Mary replies, tracing a gentle circle on the wooden desk with her finger. She built a small wooden frame, like a cradle. She would slide the cradle under the dough, and lift the frame instead. The pastry never carried its own weight. The cradle did. The quiet room seems to hold its breath. David stares at the mug in his hands, and then he looks back at the sprawling blueprint. The chaotic web of lines suddenly seems to shift, reorganizing themselves in his tired mind. A brilliant, quiet spark ignites in the dark corners of his imagination. We don't lift the deckhouse, he whispers, his eyes widening in the dim light. He sets the coffee down, his hand suddenly steady. He reaches under his desk and retrieves his pencil. We don't attach the crane hooks to the deckhouse at all. Mary watches as his pencil begins to fly across the paper. The exhaustion has vanished from his posture, replaced by a beautiful, flowing energy. We build a cradle, David says, his voice gaining a quiet, thrilling momentum. He sketches a series of heavy, temporary steel beams beneath the delicate structure. A lifting frame. We weld temporary strongbacks beneath the floorboards. The cranes lift the frame, and the frame cradles the deckhouse. The piece never feels its own weight. It just rests, completely safe. It is such a simple, profoundly human solution. It did not require advanced calculus or breaking the laws of physics. It simply required the gentle wisdom of a mother baking pastries in a warm kitchen, shared in the dark of night by a friend holding a cup of coffee. Mary smiles, a deep, radiant smile that reaches her tired eyes. "It's beautiful, David," she whispers. For the next few hours, the drafting room is filled with a new, deeply satisfying rhythm. The scratch of graphite on paper, the soft brush of the eraser, the quiet murmurs of confirmation. David and Mary work side by side, their minds moving in perfect harmony. They draw the cradles, they calculate the lifting points, they solve the puzzle of the sky. As they finish the final, elegant schematic, a subtle change begins to happen in the room. The absolute darkness outside the tall glass windows begins to soften. The deep black of the sky slowly gives way to a pale, bruised violet, and then to a soft, luminous gray. Dawn is breaking over the muddy flats. The distant hum of the shipyard begins to swell, rising from a quiet murmur into the steady, rumbling heartbeat of the morning shift. The great cranes are waking up, their engines purring in the crisp ocean air. David leans back on his wooden stool, his back popping softly. He looks down at the completed blueprint. It is a masterpiece of quiet genius, forged in the lonely hours of the night. It is the roadmap that will allow ordinary hands to lift mountains of steel into the air. He rolls the heavy paper into a neat cylinder, tying it with a piece of soft cotton string. He hands it to Mary. "Take it down to the framing foreman," David whispers, his voice thick with a beautiful, overwhelming exhaustion. "Tell him the sky is ready." Mary takes the rolled paper, holding it as carefully as she would a newborn child. She touches his shoulder gently, a silent thank you for the miracle they have just shared, and walks quietly out of the drafting room, heading down into the waking yard. David turns off his green-shaded desk lamp. The warm, amber pool of light vanishes, replaced by the cool, pale blue of the morning sun streaming through the glass. He rests his head on his folded arms upon the slanted wooden board. Outside, the thousands of workers are picking up their tools, entirely unaware of the quiet battle that was fought and won for them in the dark. They will look up at the sky later today and watch thousands of tons of steel float gracefully through the air, resting safely in their cradles, and they will know that the impossible is finally happening. But for now, in the quiet sanctuary of the drafting room, the architect of that miracle simply closes his eyes, letting the soothing, rhythmic hum of the shipyard sing him into a deep, peaceful, and well-earned slumber. There is a profound, quiet beauty in watching something impossibly heavy suddenly learn how to fly. If you were to stand in the damp, muddy center of the shipyard just as the morning mist began to lift off the bay, you would see a forest of steel rising into the pale sky. The yard was filled with massive, towering cranes. To a stranger, they might look like terrifying, skeletal beasts of burden. But to the men and women who lived in their shadows, they were gentle giants. They were the silent dancers of the shoreline, waiting for the music to begin. Up until this moment, the ship had been a puzzle scattered across the earth. In the quiet sheds, workers had stitched together enormous sections of the vessel, deckhouses, bulkheads, sweeping walls of the hull. They were beautiful, but they were bound to the dirt. Now, thanks to the quiet genius born in a midnight drafting room, it was time to lift the earth into the sky. It was time for the iron ballet. Let us climb the high, narrow metal stairs, ascending far above the noise and the mud, into a small, glass-enclosed cabin suspended in the clouds. Here, in this lonely sanctuary, sits an older man named Joseph. Before the world grew so dark and complicated, Joseph operated a small, wooden ferry on a quiet, sleepy river in the Midwest. He spent his life ferrying farmers and their wagons back and forth across a gentle current, watching the seasons change in the reflection of the water. He knows the subtle, unspoken language of momentum, of weight, and of drifting. Now, he is the master of the sky. He sits in an old, padded chair that smells faintly of tobacco and worn leather. The cabin is bitterly cold, the ocean wind rattling the glass panes, but he pays it no mind. He rests his thick, calloused hands on a series of tall metal levers. Below him, the entire shipyard spreads out like a miniature world. The thousands of workers look like grains of sand, moving in slow, deliberate currents. It is a terribly isolating place to be, high up in the gray morning. The noise of the yard, the hammers, the engines, the shouts, cannot reach him here. He exists in a profound, sweeping silence. But he does not feel entirely alone. He looks down and feels an invisible, unbreakable tether connecting his heart to the people below. He knows that in a few moments, their lives will depend entirely on the gentleness of his hands. Joseph unscrews the top of a battered thermos and pours a small cup of chicory coffee. He watches the steam curl against the cold glass. He reaches into the breast pocket of his heavy wool coat and pulls out a silver pocket watch. It belonged to his grandfather. It ticks with a soft, reassuring rhythm, a tiny heartbeat in the immense quiet. He checks the time. The sun is just beginning to break through the overcast sky, casting long, golden ribbons across the dark water of the bay. It is time. Far below, a young woman named Sarah is standing on the incomplete deck of the ship. She is a rigger. She wears heavy, canvas overalls, and around her neck, tucked safely beneath her collar, is a small, silver locket containing a photograph of her older brother. He is out there, somewhere in the vast Pacific, serving on a destroyer. Every time the heavy steel plates clatter, she feels the cold metal of the locket press against her skin, a quiet reminder of why she is standing in the freezing wind. Sarah holds a thick, braided rope in her gloved hands. It is a guideline, attached to a massive, 60-ton section of the ship's upper deck that currently rests on the muddy ground 100 yards away. She looks up, shielding her eyes from the pale sun, and finds Joseph's tiny, glass cabin in the sky. She cannot see his face, but she raises her hand in a slow, deliberate wave. High above, Joseph sees the movement. He nods, though he knows she cannot see him. He sets his coffee down. He wraps his hands around the cold iron levers. He takes a long, slow breath, holding the frigid air in his lungs, and gently pulls back. The ballet begins. There is a deep, low groan that vibrates through the entire shipyard, a sound so profound it feels as though the earth itself is shifting. The massive steel cables, thick as a man's wrist, pull taut. They sing a tight, high-pitched note as they take the incredible weight. And then, the impossible happens. The 60-ton deckhouse, cradled safely in the temporary steel frame designed in the dark of night, simply detaches from the earth. It rises. It floats. It moves with an agonizingly slow, majestic grace. It does not swing. It does not jerk. Joseph is coaxing the steel upward with the same delicate care a father uses to lift a sleeping child from a chair. He feels every ounce of the tension in the levers, translating the massive weight into small, microscopic adjustments of his wrists. Down below, the yard falls completely silent. The welding torches are extinguished. The hammers stop falling. Thousands of faces turn upward, watching the sky. It is a moment of pure, collective awe. To see a piece of a ship, large enough to be a building on its own, drifting silently across the morning clouds, is to witness a modern miracle. It is a heavy, dark world, but up there, in the cold air, the steel looks weightless. It looks like hope. Sarah watches the shadow of the colossal piece slide across the mud, creeping closer and closer to the hull. As it begins its descent, moving toward her position on the deck, her heart begins to race, a rapid, nervous fluttering against her ribs. This is the most dangerous moment. The piece must fit perfectly, sliding into place with only inches to spare. If the wind catches it, if it twists even a fraction of a degree, the steel will violently collide, tearing through the hull and anyone standing near it. She grips her guide rope tighter. She plants her boots firmly on the cold iron deck. The massive structure drifts lower, blocking out the sun, casting a deep, sudden twilight over Sarah and the other riggers. The air grows noticeably colder in the shadow of the iron. Now comes the silent dialogue. Joseph, suspended in his glass box, cannot hear Sarah. Sarah cannot hear Joseph. They must communicate entirely through the subtle tension of the ropes and the gentle swaying of the steel. Sarah pulls on her rope, leaning her entire body weight backward, using her small frame to gently coax the 60-ton giant just a few inches to the left. High above, Joseph feels the subtle shift in the cables. He understands her request. He eases a lever forward, inching the crane's boom to perfectly match her pull. It is a dance of absolute, implicit trust. Sarah is trusting the old ferryman in the sky not to drop the world upon her shoulders. Joseph is trusting the young woman on the deck to be his eyes where he cannot see. They are strangers, separated by hundreds of feet of cold air, yet in this moment, they are bound together closer than family. The deckhouse hovers just 2 feet above the hull. Sarah holds her breath. She makes a small, sharp motion with her hand. Hold. Joseph freezes the levers. The steel hangs entirely motionless in the air. The silence is so heavy, so profound, that Sarah can hear the soft, distant lapping of the waves against the shoreline. She checks the alignment. It is perfect. A flawless, mathematical embrace waiting to happen. She looks up at the sky one last time, and slowly lowers her hand flat, palm down. Joseph exhales, a long, shaky breath that mists the glass in front of him. He gently, ever so gently, releases the tension. The deckhouse settles. Thud. It is not a violent crash. It is a deep, resonant sigh. The steel kisses the deck, resting perfectly upon its supports. The massive puzzle piece has found its home. Instantly, the tension in the shipyard shatters. A collective, rushing breath sweeps through the yard, followed immediately by the sudden, fierce blooming of hundreds of blue and white sparks. The welders rush forward, striking their arcs, instantly stitching the new piece into the fabric of the ship. They must lock it down before the sea breeze can shift it. Sarah drops the guide rope. Her legs are trembling from the adrenaline, but a brilliant, radiant smile breaks across her face. She reaches beneath her collar and gently touches the silver locket. She whispers a quiet thank you into the cold air. High above, Joseph leans back in his padded chair. He picks up his small cup of chicory coffee. It is entirely cold now, but he drinks it anyway, savoring the bitter taste. He watches the tiny, brilliant stars of the welders below, securing the work he has just delivered. He feels a profound, deeply settling peace. There is something so incredibly powerful about the visual scale of these moments. The sheer size of the vessels, the immense, terrifying beauty of the machinery, and the small, brave humans standing amidst it all. It paints a picture that words can barely capture. When we try to understand the true magnitude of what they accomplished, seeing it with our own eyes changes everything. It connects us to their reality in a way that is immediate and visceral. If you find yourself longing to truly see this era, to hold a piece of that history in your hands or watch the breathtaking scale of the Pacific Fleet come to life on your screen, I highly recommend visiting Amazon. You can find incredible, authentic WWII memorabilia to carefully preserve in your own home, or you can watch the stunning movie Midway on Prime, which beautifully captures the awe-inspiring reality of the ocean they were trying to tame. But please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the afternoon sun begins its slow descent, painting the sky in soft shades of lavender and bruised peach, the iron ballet continues. Piece by piece, the ship is rising. It is no longer just a collection of flat plates and wooden scaffolding. It has an unmistakable shape. The sweeping, proud curve of the bow points bravely toward the open water. The towering island of the bridge watches over the flat, expansive runway of the flight deck. Joseph remains in the sky, lifting piece after piece. The exhaustion settles deep into his shoulders, an ache that he welcomes, for it is the ache of a promise being kept. Sarah remains on the deck, catching the falling steel, her hands blistered but her spirit soaring higher than the cranes. When night finally falls, the yard does not sleep. The floodlights click on, casting long, dramatic shadows across the muddy flats. The ballet simply changes its lighting. The ships, once ghostly silhouettes, now glow with the warm, internal light of 1,000 sparks. The rhythm of the work has become a lullaby. The soft clatter of the tools, the deep hum of the generators, the distant calling of the gulls, it all blends together into a soothing, protective blanket wrapped around the coastline. The impossible timeline is slipping away, day by day, hour by hour. But the panic is gone. The workers move with a quiet, poetic certainty. They know they are not just beating the clock. They are writing a love letter to the boys in the dark, written in the unbreakable language of iron and fire. And as Joseph looks down from his glass sanctuary, watching the magnificent ship resting in its cradle, preparing for the sea, he knows that the hardest part is over. They have taught the heavy steel how to fly. Now, they just need to teach it how to swim. Time changes its gentle rhythm when you are racing against the dark. In the final, frantic stretch of those impossibly short days, the calendars simply ceased to exist. For the men and women covered in the mud and dust of the shipyard, there were no longer Tuesdays or Thursdays. There were no mornings or afternoons. There was only the quiet, unbroken blur of the work, and the slow, majestic arc of the sun sweeping across the sky. They were chasing the setting sun, trying to catch the horizon before the clock struck its final, defining hour. To look at the shipyard now was to see a completely different world than the one that had existed just a dozen days before. The scattered, muddy puzzle pieces were gone. In their place, resting heavily upon the wooden timber blocks, was a breathtaking mountain of steel. The vessel was entirely whole. Its sweeping gray hull rose up from the earth like a protective wall, casting a long, cool shadow over the weary workers below. But a ship is not finished when its walls are raised. It must be given a nervous system. It must be given breath, and light, and warmth. Deep inside the belly of the massive ship, in the narrow, echoing steel corridors that smelled of ozone and ocean damp, a young woman named Florence was working in the quiet dark. Florence had small, nimble hands. Before the world had asked her to build a warship, she had spent her days in a sunlit bakery, her fingers gently braiding soft, sweet dough. Now, her hands were wrapped in strips of torn cotton cloth, because the stiff leather of her work gloves had worn thin against the rough steel. She was pulling miles of heavy, black electrical cable through the dark veins of the ship. It was exhausting, invisible work. She crouched in the low passageways, guided only by the soft, amber glow of a caged work lamp hanging from a pipe. Her muscles ached with a deep, throbbing rhythm that seemed to match the distant hum of the generators outside. Her back was stiff, and her eyes burned from the lack of sleep. Yet, as she gently coaxed the thick cables around a tight corner, pulling them taut and securing them to the bulkhead, Florence did not feel despair. She felt a strange, profound peace. She knew that these cables would carry the light. She imagined a young sailor, months from now, caught in a terrifying, freezing storm in the middle of the Pacific. She imagined him walking down this exact corridor, flipping a small metal switch on the wall, and feeling a sudden wave of comfort as the overhead lights hummed to life, chasing the shadows away. Florence was not just pulling wires, she was weaving a blanket of light for boys she would never meet. She poured every ounce of her quiet, motherly tenderness into the cold metal, hoping that somehow, the steel would remember her warmth. A few decks above her, in what would soon be the crew's sleeping quarters, an older man named William was holding a wide brush. William was a quiet soul, a man who had spent his entire life coaxing beauty out of worn things. He was a painter. The air around him smelled sharply of fresh, gray enamel. His overalls were speckled with countless tiny dots of paint, looking like a pale, terrestrial galaxy. He moved his brush with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Shoo! S-H-H-H, S-H-H-H. The soft, sweeping sound was a gentle lullaby in the echoing room. He was sealing the steel, protecting it from the biting salt of the ocean air. William was profoundly tired. His joints, worn down by decades of labor, protested with every stroke. He had not slept in his own bed in 3 days, opting instead to catch a few fleeting hours of rest on a pile of canvas tarps in the corner of the paint shed. But as he watched the smooth, gray paint glide over the rough welds, covering the scars of construction, a deep, spiritual energy seemed to carry his arm. He reached the inside of a small, metal locker. It was a space where a young man would soon keep his most precious, fragile belongings, a photograph of a sweetheart, a letter from home, a cherished book. William dipped a very small, fine-tipped brush into a tin of white paint. Deep in the corner of the locker, completely hidden from the casual eye, he painted a tiny, perfect star. Beneath it, in beautiful, looping script, he wrote 2 words, "Safe return." It was a secret prayer. A quiet whisper embedded in the very bones of the ship. He knew no officer would ever see it, and perhaps even the boy who used the locker might never notice it in the dark. But William knew it was there. It was his own private offering to the universe, a desperate, loving wish folded into the shadows of the war. These quiet, hidden moments of grace were the true foundation of the era. So much of the courage and love that sustained the world during those heavy years was tucked away out of sight, just like William's painted prayer or Florence's hidden cables. The grand history books tell us about the sweeping battles and the loud, public victories, but the real soul of the struggle existed in the quiet shadows. There were entire operations, profoundly brave and deeply secret, that were carried out in the dark corners of the world by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. If you find yourself drawn to these hidden narratives, to the quiet mysteries and the unseen heroism that truly shaped the world, I would love to share something very special with you. Through my email newsletter, I offer a free, beautifully crafted ebook called The Shadow War, 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II. It is a gentle, fascinating journey into the profound secrets of the past. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the afternoon of the final day began to wane, the light outside the ship slowly shifted. The harsh, bright white of the midday sun softened into a rich, liquid gold. The frantic sprint was reaching its end. The thousands of workers moving across the scaffolding and the decks began to naturally, beautifully slow down. The great symphony of the shipyard, which had roared with the clatter of hammers and the hiss of torches for nearly 2 weeks, was beginning its final, fading decrescendo. Florence pulled her last length of cable. She secured it with a gentle, final twist of her tired hands. She sat back on her heels in the dim corridor, wiping a smudge of grease from her forehead with the back of her cotton-wrapped wrist. She listened. The air around her was growing strangely quiet. Up in the crew quarters, William laid his wide brush gently across the top of his paint tin. He took a slow step back, his boots sticking slightly to the protective canvas on the floor. He looked at the smooth, perfect walls. The room was ready. It was no longer a construction site, it was a sanctuary waiting for its inhabitants. One by one, all across the massive shipyard, the tools were put down. A heavy iron wrench clinked softly as it was placed into a leather tool belt. The bright, blinding stars of the welding torches were extinguished, leaving small, cooling trails of blue smoke drifting up into the golden air. The massive engines of the cranes were cut, their deep rumbling sighing into a profound, sweeping silence. The workers began to emerge from the belly of the ship and climb down from the high scaffolding. They moved like sleepwalkers, their bodies heavy with an exhaustion so deep it felt as though it had settled into their very souls. They were covered in rust, grease, mud, and paint. Their faces were hollowed by fatigue, their eyes red-rimmed and heavy. They gathered slowly on the muddy flats, standing shoulder to shoulder in the cool evening breeze. They turned, as one massive, quiet family, to look at what they had just done. The sun was dipping low on the horizon, painting the sky in breathtaking shades of bruised peach, soft lavender, and deep, fiery orange. The golden light caught the fresh gray paint of the carrier, making the steel look warm and alive. It was breathtaking. It was impossible. 13 days ago, this space had been nothing but cold mud and empty air. Now, standing before them, casting a long, protective shadow over the shoreline, was a leviathan of hope. It was perfect. It was whole. As they stared up at the sweeping bow, a quiet, spiritual energy swept through the crowd. It wasn't the loud, cheering triumph of a sports victory. It was something much deeper, much more sacred. It was the overwhelming, tearful realization of their own boundless potential. Florence stood near the front, her wrapped hands resting gently against her chest. She felt a warm tear trace a clean line down her soot-stained cheek. Beside her, William took off his soft canvas cap, holding it over his heart, his eyes shimmering in the fading light. They didn't just beat the brass's timeline. They didn't just break the records of history. They had beaten their own deepest fears. They had proven, in the most magnificent, tangible way possible, that when the night is at its darkest, the human spirit can simply decide to build its own sun. Nobody spoke. There were no words large enough to fill the space between them and the massive ship. There was only the gentle sound of the ocean lapping against the shore, and the soft, collective breathing of thousands of everyday heroes. The sun finally slipped below the horizon, pulling the fiery colors down with it, leaving behind a soft, velvety twilight. The first pale stars began to appear over the dark water of the bay. The ship stood silent and strong in the dusk, resting in its wooden cradle, holding all of their secret prayers, their hidden kindnesses, and their quiet tears within its steel heart. The frantic sprint was over. The setting sun had been chased and caught. Now, in the beautiful, soothing quiet of the evening, there was only one thing left to do. They had built the impossible sanctuary. Tomorrow, they would gently give it to the sea. There is a profound, trembling stillness that settles over the world just before a miracle is finally set free. For 13 days, the muddy shoreline had been entirely consumed by a deafening, beautiful chaos. It was a world of fire and iron, of shouting voices, ringing hammers, and the deep, rumbling growls of heavy engines. The workers had pushed their bodies and their spirits to the absolute edge of human endurance. But on the morning of the 14th day, as a pale, silvery light began to wash over the coast, the shipyard was entirely, breathtakingly silent. The great iron ballet was over. The cranes stood perfectly still, their long booms resting against the bruised morning sky like the bowed heads of tired giants. The welding torches were cold. The heavy wrenches lay quietly in their leather pouches. Resting upon a massive cradle of greased wooden timber was the ship. It was no longer a collection of scattered plates and disjointed dreams. It was a magnificent, sweeping vessel, painted in a fresh, pristine gray that seemed to catch and hold the soft light of the dawn. It was enormous, a mountain of steel that cast a long, protective shadow over the thousands of people gathered at its base. They did not look like shipbuilders this morning. They looked like a congregation. The men and women of the yard had arrived early, standing shoulder to shoulder in the cool, damp air. Many of them had washed the heavy mud from their faces and combed their hair. Some wore their simple Sunday clothes, others wore their work overalls, brushed clean of the daily dust. They stood in absolute silence, their breath pluming in the chill, their eyes fixed upward on the towering bow of the ship. Let us walk softly among them, and stand beside Margaret. You might remember Margaret, the gentlewoman who had spent her life sewing delicate fabrics in a sunlit parlor before picking up a welding torch. She is standing very close to the massive hull. Her hands, tucked deep into the pockets of her wool coat, are trembling slightly. She takes a slow, careful step forward. She reaches out with her bare right hand, her fingers small and delicate against the immensity of the vessel. She presses her palm flat against the cold, painted steel. Beneath the smooth gray enamel, she can feel the faint, raised ridge of a weld. It is the seam she had fused together on her very first night, when the sparks had terrified her and the steel felt too heavy to bear. She closes her eyes, feeling the cold metal warming beneath her touch. It is no longer just a wall of iron. To her, it feels like the steady, rising and falling chest of a sleeping protector. All along the length of the slipway, other workers are doing the same. A quiet, older farmer, whose son is lost somewhere in the freezing Atlantic, rests his calloused forehead against the steel, his eyes closed in a silent, desperate prayer. A young draftswoman traces the sweeping curve of the hull, marveling at how the lines she drew on fragile paper in the middle of the night have become something so magnificently real. They are touching the ship as if saying goodbye to a child leaving home. They are leaving their invisible fingerprints, their quiet hopes, and their boundless love pressed deep into the very bones of the vessel. The air smells deeply of the sea, mixing with the sharp scent of fresh paint and the heavy, earthy aroma of the thick tallow grease spread across the wooden launching rails. It takes a monumental amount of care, research, and quiet dedication to unearth these fragile, fleeting moments of the past. The grand history books often skip over the silent tears of a farmer touching a steel hull, or a seamstress whispering a prayer into a welded seam. Gathering these forgotten memories, reading through the faded, handwritten letters, and carefully weaving them into these soothing journeys is a labor of profound love. If you find a sense of peace in these stories, and if you would like to help support the massive amount of time it takes to gently pull these human moments from the shadows of time, I have created a small Ko-Fi tip jar. Even the smallest token of support allows me to continue preserving these beautiful lives, ensuring their quiet heroism is never forgotten. But please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. A gentle breeze sweeps off the bay, carrying the salty promise of the open water. Up on a small wooden platform near the towering bow, a young woman steps forward. She is the wife of a sailor, chosen to offer the final blessing. In her hands, wrapped in delicate red, white, and blue ribbons, she holds a bottle of champagne. The crowd holds its collective breath. The silence is so absolute that you can hear the soft rustle of the ribbons in the wind. She speaks a few quiet words, her voice trembling with emotion, carrying softly across the morning air. She blesses the ship, and all the souls who will find sanctuary upon her decks. With a graceful, sweeping motion, she swings the bottle. It meets the solid steel of the bow with a sharp, crisp clink. The glass shatters. The pale, golden liquid foams and cascades down the side of the pristine gray hull. It looks just like a single, beautiful tear falling from the eye of the gentle giant. And then, the final tether is released. Beneath the ship, a team of riggers swings heavy wooden mallets, knocking away the last of the restraining blocks. There is a deep, echoing thwack, followed by the sudden, sharp groan of heavy timber taking the full, impossible weight of the vessel. For a single, agonizing second, nothing happens. The ship rests there, hesitating on the edge of the land. Then, very slowly, gravity begins to wake up. A low, resonant rumble vibrates through the earth, traveling up through the soles of the workers' boots. It is a sound that settles deep in the chest. The massive ship begins to slide. It moves down the greased wooden rails with an agonizingly slow, majestic grace. It does not rush. It seems to glide, inch by incredible inch. As it gathers a gentle momentum, the friction between the heavy wood and the slipway sends up small, fragrant puffs of white smoke. The workers do not cheer. They do not shout. They simply stand perfectly still, their faces upturned, watching the sky suddenly open up above them as the 60-ton shadow moves away from the shore. The stern of the ship meets the water. there is a magnificent, rolling splash, a gentle, sweeping wave of white foam that pushes outward into the bay. The ocean reaches up, embracing the steel, welcoming the newborn sanctuary into its depths. The massive vessel slides completely off the wooden rails. It dips slightly, bowing low to the water, and then, with a graceful, perfect buoyancy, it rights itself. It settles into the gentle swell of the bay, bobbing softly on the tide. It floats. The impossible dream, born from the mud just 13 days ago, is now riding the very waves it was built to conquer. And it is in this beautiful, quiet moment that the dam finally breaks. The tension of the last 2 weeks, the exhaustion, the midnight fears, the blistered hands, and the terrible, silent dread of failing, washes entirely away. All across the shoreline, hardened men and women simply crumble. Margaret covers her mouth with her trembling, scarred hands, her eyes overflowing with hot, heavy tears. She leans into the shoulder of the older foreman beside her, and he wraps a thick, protective arm around her, weeping just as openly. The farmer falls to his knees in the soft dirt. He takes off his cap, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with profound, overwhelming relief. He looks out at the ship, knowing that his son finally has a shield to hide behind. Everywhere you look, there are tears. They are not tears of sorrow. They are the purest, most beautiful tears of absolute love and exhausted joy. The workers hold onto one another, strangers who became a family, bound together by the mud, the fire, and the overwhelming pride of what they have achieved. They weep because they are so tired. They weep because it is over. But mostly, they weep because they realize, in the quiet depths of their souls, that they have actually done it. They have caught the sun. They have beaten the ticking clock. They have built a floating fortress of hope for a world that so desperately needed one. Out on the water, the ship pulls gently at its mooring lines. The morning sun breaks fully through the clouds, bathing the gray steel in a brilliant, golden light. The vessel seems to hum with a quiet, peaceful energy, carrying the warmth of 10,000 hands within its hull. The symphony of the shipyard is finally silent, replaced by the gentle, soothing sound of the waves lapping against the shore, a quiet lullaby for the gentle giant preparing to sail into the dawn. Even in the deepest, most isolated corners of the ocean, the warmth of home can still find a way to reach you. For so long, the dark expanse of the sea had been a realm of quiet terror. It was an endless, rolling wilderness where the shadows seemed to hold their breath, waiting to pull fragile, desperate ships down into the freezing depths. The boys who sailed those waters had learned to sleep with one eye open, listening to the agonizing creak of thin metal, feeling the icy dread seep into their very bones with every crashing wave. But tonight, the ocean feels different. The water is still vast, still unfathomable, stretching out in every direction until the midnight blue of the sea melts seamlessly into the starry canopy of the sky. Yet, the paralyzing fear has gently washed away, replaced by a profound, rhythmic sense of peace. The sea is no longer a hunter. It is simply a cradle. Let us travel far away from the muddy, torn earth of the shipyards. Let us leave the echoing noise of the cranes and the brilliant sparks of the welders behind, and drift out into the great, quiet swells of the Pacific. Here, cutting gracefully through the dark water, is the miracle they built. It does not look like a machine of war in the moonlight. With its sweeping, solid hull and its long, flat flight deck reaching toward the horizon, it looks like a beautiful, floating island. It is a piece of solid, unwavering ground carved right out of the restless ocean. Stand with me on the high catwalk, just beneath the edge of the flight deck, and let us watch a young sailor named Leo. Leo is only 19 years old. Just a year ago, his entire world was a quiet, golden ocean of wheat in the American Midwest. He knew the sound of wind rustling through tall grass, the comforting creak of a wooden porch swing, and the smell of sun-baked earth after a summer rain. He had never seen a body of water larger than the old quarry behind his family's farm. Now, he leans against the cold, painted steel railing, bundled in a thick, heavy wool pea coat. The collar is turned up against the biting ocean wind, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The salty mist kisses his cheeks, leaving a cool, damp layer on his skin. He looks out at the endless horizon, watching the moonlight shatter into a million silver fragments on the surface of the water. He is thousands of miles from the safety of his porch swing, floating in a world that is entirely alien to him. And yet, as he stands there in the dark, Leo is not afraid. He feels the deep, steady, comforting thrum of the ship's engines vibrating through the thick soles of his boots. It is a slow, rhythmic pulse. Thump, thump, thump. It feels exactly like a heartbeat. It is the heartbeat of 1,000 strangers, of the farmers, the bakers, the school teachers, and the seamstresses who poured their souls into this iron. Leo doesn't know their names. He doesn't know about Henry's impossible 13-day promise, or the tears that fell on the slipway, or the midnight drafts drawn by weary architects. He only knows that this ship is a sanctuary. When the ocean throws its weight against the hull, sending massive, rolling swells crashing against the steel, the ship does not shudder in terror. It simply rises. It lifts Leo up toward the stars with a slow, majestic confidence, and then settles back into the trough with a gentle, reassuring sigh. The welds hold fast. The steel does not bend. The invisible hands of the builders are holding the ocean at bay, keeping him completely, wonderfully safe. Leo turns away from the wind and steps through a heavy, watertight door, pulling it shut behind him. The howling of the sea is instantly muted, replaced by the warm, humming life of the ship's interior. To walk through the narrow, brightly lit corridors of the carrier is to walk through a small, thriving village. The air down here is incredibly warm, carrying a beautiful, comforting mixture of scents. There is the rich, dark smell of machine oil and hot steam from the engine rooms, mingling gracefully with the aroma of roasted coffee and baking bread drifting down from the galleys. Leo walks down the passageway, running his fingertips lightly along the gray-painted bulkhead. He is walking past the invisible signatures of the people who saved him. He passes beneath the electrical cables that a young woman named Florence had painstakingly secured with her blistered hands. He is bathed in the warm, steady light that her quiet dedication made possible. He steps into the mess hall. It is a large, cavernous room filled with rows of metal tables. At this late hour, it is wonderfully quiet. A few off-duty sailors sit in the corners, reading worn paperback books or quietly writing letters home. The soft murmur of their voices blends with the gentle, constant sway of the room. Leo walks over to a large, gleaming silver urn and pours himself a thick, ceramic mug of hot cocoa. He wraps his cold hands around it, letting the heat seep into his palms, closing his eyes in pure, simple gratitude. In this warm, floating room, the war feels very far away. It is a rare, beautiful pocket of peace suspended in the middle of a turbulent world. There is a profound difference between the sanitized newsreels that were played in the theaters back home and the raw, unvarnished reality of living out on the open swells. The history we are often handed is incredibly clean, edited to show only the brave smiles and the triumphant flags. But out here, on the water, the reality was deeply human. It was full of quiet fears, overwhelming isolation, and a raw, rugged beauty that the cameras rarely captured. If you are someone who wishes to look past the polished history, to truly understand the unfiltered, deeply personal experiences of the people who lived through these extraordinary times, I have created a quiet, dedicated space just for you. Through my Patreon, we gather as a deep-dive community of history lovers. There, I share free, full-length podcasts, and we explore the raw, unblurred video sections and photographs of the era that are simply too real, too heavy, and too honest to be shared on a public platform. It is a place to honor the complete, uncensored truth of their journey. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Leo finishes his warm drink, the sweet chocolate chasing away the last of the ocean chill. He washes his mug in the small, metal sink, moving with the slow, deliberate ease of a man who feels entirely at home. He makes his way down another flight of steep metal stairs, descending deeper into the protective belly of the ship, into the crew's sleeping quarters. The room is dimly lit by soft, red bulbs designed to protect their night vision. It is filled with rows of canvas bunks, stacked 3 high. The air is filled with the soft, collective breathing of 100 sleeping men. It is a chorus of exhaustion and trust. Occasionally, someone shifts in their sleep or murmurs a quiet, disjointed word from a dream, but the overarching feeling is one of absolute serenity. Leo walks softly to his bunk, careful not to wake his brothers. He reaches into his small, gray metal locker to retrieve a fresh pair of wool socks. As he opens the small metal door, the dim red light catches the inside corner of the locker. There, perfectly preserved beneath the smooth enamel, is a tiny, meticulously painted white star and 2 words written in a sweeping, gentle script, "Safe return." Leo pauses. He traces the words with a calloused thumb. He doesn't know about William, the tired, older painter who had left this secret prayer in the dark. He doesn't know the ache in William's joints, or the tears that had fallen on the slipway on the morning of the launch. But Leo feels the intention. He feels the profound, protective love radiating from that tiny star. He sits on the edge of his narrow canvas bunk. He takes out a piece of thin, pale blue paper and a fountain pen. He balances a small, wooden clipboard on his knees and begins to write a letter to his mother back in the quiet fields of the Midwest. He doesn't write about the dark water or the terrifying storms they have sailed through. He doesn't write about the Shadow War. Instead, he writes about the warmth of the galley. He writes about the incredibly beautiful sunsets that turn the entire ocean into a canvas of liquid gold. And then, he writes about the ship. "Mom," his pen scratches softly in the quiet room, "you don't have to worry about me out here. I know the ocean is big, and I know I am very far from home. But the ship they built for us, it isn't just a boat. It feels like a fortress. It feels like someone wrapped their arms around us and promised not to let go. When the wind blows hard, the ship just hums. It sings to us. I am safe, Mom. I am entirely safe." He folds the letter carefully, placing it into an envelope. He slips it under his thin pillow, a promise of comfort to be sent across the world. Leo lies back in his bunk, pulling the heavy wool blanket up to his chin. The gentle, rolling motion of the ship acts as a massive, soothing cradle. The low, distant rumble of the engines is a protective lullaby, whispering that the watch is set, the fires are burning, and the heart of the ship is strong. He reaches out, his hand resting against the cold steel of the bulkhead beside his bed. Somewhere, thousands of miles away, a woman named Margaret is resting her tired, scarred hands. A man named David is sleeping soundly, free from the terrifying math of the midnight drafting board. A ferryman named Joseph is watching the sun rise over a quiet river. They will never meet. The gap between the muddy shipyard and the vast, rolling Pacific is too wide to cross. But as Leo closes his eyes, drifting away into a deep, dreamless sleep, he whispers a quiet, heartfelt thank you into the red-lit dark. The steel carries the whisper. It vibrates through the hull, into the deep water, and out across the tides. Outside, the darkest hours of the night finally begin to break. A soft, pale ribbon of light appears on the eastern horizon, turning the black water to a deep, calming indigo. The floating sanctuary presses onward, carving a path through the gentle swells, carrying its precious cargo of souls toward the warmth of a new, breaking dawn. There is a profound, almost heavy weight to sudden silence, a breathless pause when a world that has only known the roaring engines of survival finally learns how to exhale. For years, the shoreline had been defined by its beautiful, deafening noise. The shipyard was a living, breathing creature that never slept. It spoke in the language of crashing steel, the rhythmic thud of the dropped forge, the hiss of steam, and the sharp, crackling sizzle of 10,000 welding torches. The people who worked the muddy flats had grown so accustomed to this symphony of industry that the hum of the generators felt like their own rushing blood. It was the noise of defiance. It was the sound of a promise being kept. But all storms, no matter how vast and terrifying, eventually break. Imagine a warm, late summer afternoon. The air hanging over the bay is thick and golden, smelling of salt and baked earth. High up on the framing deck, the workers are moving with their usual, steady rhythm. The blue stars of the welding arcs are blooming against the gray steel. And then, down in the main office, a small wooden radio crackles to life. The news does not arrive with a grand, cinematic explosion. It arrives as a crackling, static-filled voice, uttering a few simple, miraculous words. It travels through the open windows of the office, caught by the sea breeze, and washes over the nearest riggers. Watch how the news spreads. It is not a shout. It is a gentle, rippling wave of disbelief. A foreman lowers his clipboard, his jaw going slack. He turns to the woman beside him and whispers the words. She drops her heavy canvas gloves, pressing her bare hands against her mouth, tears instantly pooling in her eyes. She turns to the next worker. Slowly, gracefully, the yard begins to shut down. A welder, entirely enclosed in his dark fiberglass hood, feels a tap on his shoulder. He lifts his mask, irritated at the interruption, only to see his friend weeping openly, a radiant, exhausted smile stretching across his soot-stained face. The welder turns off his torch. The brilliant blue spark fizzles, popping softly before fading into a wisp of white smoke. It is the last spark. One by one, the heavy tools are laid down. The great diesel engines of the cranes are cut, their deep, rumbling vibrations shuddering to a halt, leaving only the sound of the wind sweeping through the high cables. The towering gates of the drydocks are stilled. Then, the main shift whistle, the grand, steam-powered siren that had dictated their lives, their meals, and their sleep for years, blows one final time. It does not sound like a call to labor. It sounds like a long, mournful, beautiful sigh of relief. It echoes across the bay, bouncing off the distant hills, and then it simply fades away. The silence that rushes in to fill the space is absolute. It is so quiet that you can hear the soft lapping of the ocean waves against the wooden slipways. You can hear the cry of a lone seagull circling high above the empty cranes. The war is over. The boys are coming home. Down in the locker rooms, a long, wooden shed smelling faintly of old coffee and heavy grease, the silence is intimately, deeply personal. Arthur, the older farmer who had arrived at the yard so many lifetimes ago with soft soil on his boots, stands before his dented metal locker. He is staring at a small, faded photograph taped to the inside of the door. It is his son, wearing a slightly crooked sailor's cap, smiling out at him. For years, Arthur had looked at that photograph with a heavy, cold knot of dread sitting in his stomach. Today, the knot is entirely gone. The ocean had not taken his boy. The steel walls they built had held the dark water back. Arthur reaches up with trembling, scarred fingers and gently peels the tape away. He takes the photograph and tucks it safely into his breast pocket, resting it right over his heart. He begins to pack away his life. He folds his heavy, canvas overalls. They are stained with rust and oil, permanently smelling of the shipyard, but he cannot bring himself to throw them away. They are a monument to the hardest, most beautiful work of his life. He places his heavy iron wrench into his battered cardboard suitcase. It clinks softly against his dented tin lunchbox. He closes the lid and fastens the leather straps. All down the row of lockers, the same quiet rituals are taking place. The rustle of paper, the soft click of padlocks opening for the last time, the gentle snapping of briefcases and bags. Margaret, the gentle seamstress who had learned to tame liquid fire, is carefully winding up her welding cables. She traces the scorch marks on her thick leather apron. She looks down the row at the other women, the former librarians, the teachers, the bakers. They had shared their fears, their rations, and their late-night cups of tea. They had become sisters forged in the twilight sparks. They do not know how to say goodbye. How do you walk away from the people who held you together when the world was falling apart? Margaret steps toward a younger woman she had trained, a girl whose hands had shaken so badly on her first day. Margaret does not say a word. She simply wraps her arms around the younger woman, holding her in a tight, quiet embrace. Soon, the entire locker room is filled with soft weeping and gentle, lingering hugs. They are crying for the sheer exhaustion of it all, for the joy of peace, and for the bittersweet pain of leaving this incredible, hidden family behind. They are ordinary people, preparing to return to their ordinary lives. Tomorrow, they will go back to sweeping porches, baking bread, and grading school papers. But they know, in the quiet depths of their souls, that they will never truly be the same. They have held the lightning in their hands. They have moved mountains of steel. The raw, unpolished reality of what they experienced in this muddy yard, the profound depth of their fears and the sheer magnitude of their courage, is something that is difficult to convey in simple history books. The true nature of those years was unvarnished, heavily scarred, and deeply, intensely human. It was a reality hidden away from the bright, cheerful posters of the era. If you find yourself yearning to reach through the veil of time and truly see that unvarnished truth, to bear witness to the harsh, uncensored realities that these brave souls endured, I have curated a deeply moving collection just for you. Available through my Gumroad, it is a digital product featuring unseen, raw images and videos of the war, materials that are simply too restricted, too heavy, and too real to show on this platform. It is a quiet, respectful preservation of their true sacrifice. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the late afternoon sun begins to dip lower, painting the sky in soft shades of bruised purple and dusty rose, the workers begin the long walk out of the gates. They do not march. They stroll, moving with a slow, weary grace. They carry their cardboard suitcases and their canvas bags, their shadows stretching out long and thin across the damp earth. Arthur walks beside a man he used to know only as a rival grocer back in his hometown. Now, they walk shoulder to shoulder, their steps perfectly synchronized. They do not speak. The shared silence is a comforting blanket wrapped around them both. They pass beneath the towering, skeletal legs of the cranes, offering the silent giants a gentle nod of respect. Margaret walks out with the other welders, linking arms, their soft footsteps crunching rhythmically on the gravel road. They turn back, just once, to look at the empty slipways. The shipyard is already becoming a ghost city. Without the thousands of warm bodies moving across its surface, without the brilliant sparks and the billowing steam, it looks entirely different. It is vast, and empty, and hauntingly beautiful. The towering wooden scaffoldings stand like ancient ruins against the darkening sky. The massive dry docks, once filled with the chaotic birth of steel leviathans, are now just quiet pools of still water, reflecting the emerging stars like giant, dark mirrors. The wind sweeps gently off the bay, weaving through the empty steel girders and the high crane cables. It creates a soft, mournful humming sound, a vast aeolian harp playing a lullaby for the empty yard. The gates are pulled shut. The heavy iron latch falls into place with a deep, final echo. The workers board the waiting buses and trains, settling into the worn seats, resting their heavy heads against the glass windows. As the engines rumble to life and carry them away toward their quiet towns and their waiting families, they leave the shoreline behind. Night falls over the coast. The floodlights do not turn on. For the first time in years, the shoreline is allowed to sleep in complete, unbroken darkness. The ocean, which had been pushed back and fought against, gently reclaims its territory. The tide rolls in, washing over the muddy flats, smoothing out the thousands of overlapping footprints left in the clay. It erases the deep ruts of the heavy trucks. It softens the hard edges of the earth. The water ripples against the wooden pilings of the empty docks, a gentle, rhythmic shhhh, shhhh, shhhh. It is the oldest song in the world, the original lullaby of the earth, returning to a shore that had forgotten its tune. The sirens are silent. The fires are cold. The impossible task is done. The ghosts of the shipyard, the echoes of laughter in the mess halls, the whispered prayers over the welding seams, the tears of exhaustion hidden in the dark, will linger here forever in the salt air. But they are peaceful ghosts now. They are at rest. The dark waters of the deep hold no more terror. The world can finally close its tired eyes, safe in the knowledge that when the night was at its absolute darkest, the quiet, everyday hands of the earth reached up, grabbed the stars, and built a light that could never be extinguished. Time is a very patient ocean, washing over the shores of the past until the sharpest edges of our struggles are softened into beautiful, quiet memories. Let us take one final walk together. The sun is setting again, but we are no longer standing in the deafening, frantic shadow of an impossible dream. The world has turned many thousands of times since those heavy, desperate days. The massive, towering cranes that once lifted the earth into the sky have long since vanished, taken down piece by piece when the world finally learned how to breathe again. The shoreline today is wonderfully, profoundly quiet. There are no clanging hammers. There is no deep, rumbling growl of heavy diesel engines, and the bright, blooming sparks of the welders' torches are completely gone. In their place, there is only the tall, silver-green sea grass, swaying gently in the evening breeze. There is the soft, rhythmic sound of the tide rolling over the pebbles, washing the shore clean with a slow, hypnotic grace. If you were to walk barefoot along the edge of the water tonight, the damp sand would feel entirely ordinary beneath your toes. But if you look very closely, just as the tide pulls back into the deep, the earth occasionally reveals a secret. You might see a heavy, rusted iron piling jutting out from the mud, worn smooth by decades of salt and time. You might find a massive concrete block hiding beneath a blanket of green moss, a silent anchor that once held the weight of a rising ship. These are not just pieces of old debris. They are the fossilized footprints of a miracle. They are the quiet, resting echoes of the greatest symphony ever played by human hands. Where did they go, the thousands of souls who stood in the freezing mud and coaxed those floating sanctuaries into existence? The most beautiful truth of all is that they simply went home. They packed away their heavy leather gloves, washed the deep, stubborn grease from under their fingernails, and boarded quiet trains back to the lives they had left behind. They did not ask for grand monuments or parades. They didn't want their names carved into polished marble walls. They simply wanted the world to be soft again. They wanted the radios in their living rooms to play gentle jazz and baseball games instead of the terrifying arithmetic of the deep. Imagine Margaret, the gentle seamstress who learned to weave liquid fire in the twilight. She returned to her sunlit parlor, pulling the dusty covers off her old, cast-iron sewing machine. She picked up her delicate needles and her spools of pale thread. But as she stitched the torn collar of her husband's shirt, her husband, who had come back to her safely across the ocean she helped tame, her hands held a new, quiet power. When a winter storm rattled the window panes of their small house, Margaret no longer felt that familiar, fluttering fear. She knew she was unbreakable. She had built a fortress against the darkest storm the world had ever seen. Imagine Arthur, the older farmer, walking back up the long, dusty driveway of his rural home. He stood on his front porch in the golden hour of the afternoon, watching the wind ripple through the wheat. But he was no longer waiting with a cold knot of dread for a bicycle messenger to bring him a yellow envelope. He was waiting for his boy. And when his son finally walked up that dirt road, carrying a heavy canvas duffel bag and a tired, beautiful smile, Arthur wrapped his calloused arms around him. He pressed his face into the rough wool of his son's coat, silently thanking the cold steel that had carried his whole world safely across the treacherous swell. And think of David, the weary architect who had stayed awake through the midnight hours, designing the invisible cradles that allowed the heavy steel to fly. He returned to drawing sweeping porches and quiet, airy libraries. But tucked away in the dusty attic of his home, inside a cardboard tube, he kept one single, rolled-up blueprint. Sometimes, when the house was quiet and the rain was tapping softly on the roof, he would unroll the heavy paper. He would trace the complex web of lines with his finger, remembering the young draftswoman who brought him hot coffee in the dark, remembering how two tired friends solved a puzzle that saved the sky. They all went back to being ordinary. But because of their bruised, blistered hands, they allowed an entire generation to grow old in peace. It is a deeply human instinct to want to reach back through the veil of time and touch that history. We yearn to hold on to something tangible from an era where everyday people looked at an impossible abyss and simply built a bridge across it. We look for these physical artifacts to remind ourselves of our own hidden strength. If you find yourself wanting to connect with this profound era, to hold a piece of that history in your hands, or to watch the breathtaking visual scale of what they conquered, I highly recommend visiting Amazon. You can find beautiful, authentic WWII memorabilia to keep as a quiet reminder in your home, or you can watch the incredible movie Midway on Prime, which paints such a vivid, sweeping picture of the immense ocean they tamed. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As you look out over the peaceful, darkening water of the bay, you might wonder what happened to the ships themselves. The magnificent vessels born from the mud in just 13 days. Time is gentle, but it is also inevitable. Most of those great, gray leviathans no longer sail the waters of the world. After they brought the boys home, after their holds were emptied of worry and filled with the joyful noise of returning souls, their duty was done. Some were gently laid to rest in the deep, quiet sanctuaries of the ocean floor, far from the light of the sun. There, they have found a beautiful second life. They have become sprawling, peaceful coral reefs. The cold steel is now covered in vibrant, blooming colors, teeming with schools of silver fish and silent, gliding life. The walls that once held back the terror of the deep now offer a safe, warm home to the creatures of the sea. Others were carefully taken apart, their massive plates separated just as gently as they were put together. The steel was melted down, the fire softening the iron one last time. That same steel was reformed into the very bones of the modern world. It was poured into the foundations of tall, reaching buildings. It was shaped into the long, sweeping bridges that connect our cities. It is a beautiful, comforting thought, isn't it? The idea that tomorrow, as you drive across a sturdy bridge or walk through the doors of a quiet hospital, you might be surrounded by the very same steel that Margaret welded, that Arthur riveted, that Joseph lifted into the sky. Their work is still holding us up. Their quiet, everyday heroism is woven into the very fabric of the world we walk upon. The sun has finally slipped away, leaving the coastline bathed in the soft, silvery light of a full moon. The empty slipways look peaceful now. The ghosts of the shipyard are not the restless, sorrowful spirits of a battlefield. They are the warmest, kindest echoes you could ever hope to hear. If you close your eyes and listen to the wind coming off the water, you do not hear the frantic panic of a ticking clock. You hear the soft, musical laughter of the women sharing sweet tea from a dented thermos. You hear the gentle scratch of a fountain pen as a young man writes a letter to his mother in the red-lit belly of a ship. You hear the long, soothing note of the shift whistle, calling everyone home to rest. As you lie there tonight, feeling the soft weight of your blankets and listening to the steady, comforting rhythm of your own breathing, I want you to remember the muddy, empty shoreline. I want you to remember Henry, the architect of dust, who stood alone in the chill, looked at an impossible demand, and simply nodded his head. The greatest miracles in our history were not achieved by superheroes or by perfect people who never felt afraid. They were achieved by tired, scared, beautifully ordinary people who simply decided that the dark would not win. They were achieved by people who took the massive, overwhelming weight of the world and broke it down into small, quiet pieces. One weld. One hammer strike. One shared cup of coffee in the freezing mist. Whenever you face a mountain in your own life, whenever the night feels too long and the water feels too deep, remember the iron ballet. Remember the sparks in the twilight. You carry that exact same quiet, beautiful resilience within your own heart. You are built from the same sturdy, unbreakable spirit. You, too, are capable of building your own sanctuary in the swell. You have the strength to weather the storms, to piece together the scattered fragments of your dreams, and to create a light that will carry you through to the dawn. Let the memory of the ocean carry you now. The water is perfectly calm, smooth as dark glass reflecting a million brilliant stars. The great ships are sleeping. The weary builders have all gone home to their warm beds, their hands finally rested, their impossible promises perfectly kept. The shoreline is still. It is time for you to let go of the heavy machinery of the day. Release the tension in your shoulders, uncurl your hands, and let the gentle, rhythmic rocking of the tide lull you into the deep. Drift away on the peaceful, rolling swells of the night, knowing that you are safe, you are warm, and you are entirely at peace.